All right, hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And I had on the agenda, I was supposed to do a Christmas special, but that didn't happen. That said, they did go ahead with the show even without me on the Proselytize or Apostatize show, and that was a great show with the complete hosts of the Complete Sinner's Guide, Tyler Fowler, and another guy from that show. As well as David Russell. And they did a really great job of kind of tackling a lot of the Christmas topics. They went into a little bit on the virgin birth. Also, they tackled, the main issue from the anti-Christmas crowd. Is Christmas based on pagan myths? And they refuted that nonsense and went into quite a bit of depth. So even though I didn't make it into that show like I originally thought, check it out. Go to the Proselytize or Apostatize YouTube show and listen to that show because I thought it was really well done. Also, I've got some shows in the works for you guys in terms of special guests that I kind of retained after 2020. So there's the remainder that I want to go through in 2022 and just, finish off where I left off with those special guest invitations. I won't mention any names. I've got agreements in principle and I'm still working out the dates. I'm hoping to get enough in January, at least a couple in January and into February and stuff like that. So we've got some good stuff in the works there. But after that, after those special guest shows, I want to focus on my solo show series and finish those up for you guys. Okay, so with that said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead with what I originally promised. Then I'm going to continue on with my Shroud solo series, and I want to do another Shroud solo show. Last time we kind of finished off. Apart from Hugh Ferry and Colin Berry's newest techniques, which I'm going to cover at the end of this series, after I finish all of the image forming mechanisms, but we kind of finished the ordinary artistic mechanisms that in one way or another utilize some kind of artistic method or technique and have an artistic intention to create the images within them. This time we're going to be transitioning to the other set of theories, which are known as ordinary naturalistic hypotheses. And these hypotheses or techniques basically just suppose that, look, there was no artist, there was no intention to create the images. They just happened naturally involving a dead human corpse or body in one way or another. And in some method using the laws of nature and a dead human body alone, that was enough to create these images. So that's what we're going to be turning to in the next few parts here. And the first one to tackle is obviously the direct contact hypothesis. Either Jesus or a human dead corpse, bloody corpse, was put in the Shroud of Turin, and through direct contact with the cloth and the person, the dead body, the body images were formed, as well as with the bloodstains, the direct contact between the cloth and the bloodstains is what encoded those. In fact, recently, one of our listeners, his name, he just goes by 2335467, but he kind of made a YouTube comment on one of my Shroud Solo Show Part 3, saying that you have to prove that this is a miracle, and he was talking about how he read a book years ago that showed that images that he's saying are comparable to the Shroud of Turin's body images of some people who died at hospitals are found with their bodies imprinted on their bed sheets and that sort of thing. And apparently it happens ever so often. So he's saying, again, he's kind of pointing to, well, maybe direct contact. I mean, we have these things in hospitals. In the first place, that's not true. There might be staining in the bed sheets, but there's nothing comparable to the Shroud. It's utterly unique. Every scientist, whether atheist, agnostic, Muslim, Jewish, Christian in the world that studies the Shroud admits that it's totally unique. We'll get to that in a little bit. But nonetheless, before we get into the assessment part, there is sometimes staining. Our bodies stain our clothes when we're sweaty, or obviously blood will do that, or sometimes with direct contact hypotheses, people will say, well, it's not just what's on the human body. It's also, supposing it was Jesus, there would have been various ointments, oils, alloys, embalming substances that were put on him. And these would also play potentially a staining role when they came into contact with the cloth as well. Because they would have been put on the body, and then the cloth would have touched those. So in addition to just, sweat on the body, sweat and blood and stuff like that, or what the human body produces, there are these additional substances put on supposedly the body of Jesus, according to the Gospels, or that could have been put on another human body. And maybe they stained the Shroud of Turin and created these shroud images that we have. Okay, so just a little bit of history. So, as I mentioned, really up until 1898, when Secondo Pia took that photographic negative image of the shroud that shocked the world's scientists, everybody just assumed, with the atheists and skeptics, that it was just a medieval painting, nothing more. And then they saw the scientifically proven photographic negative images, and they went, this is not a painting. We know that for a fact. What the heck's going on here? And I kind of mentioned, I think in my Shroud Solo Show Part 5, it might be Part 4, but I mentioned that from 1900 to 1902, medical experts at the French Academy of Science, including an agnostic, Yves Delage and Paul Vignon, kind of studied the Shroud of Turin medically and proved that it was anatomically consistent with a real human corpse covering the body and the wounds that a real human being would have. Nothing like the ignorance of medieval and Renaissance painters who didn't have a clue about human anatomy at all. The Shroud of Turin gets it correct. But I bring that up because at that time, in 1902, this was the first time the direct contact ordinary naturalistic hypothesis was talked about by Paul Vignon. And he kind of mentioned that, there would have been direct contact between this dead human body covered in sweat, alloys, blood, oils, and other embalming substances. When that came into contact with the linen cloth, perhaps that created the images. And Paul Vignon, subsequent to this, in 1937, he published a Scientific American scholarly journal article where he kind of changed his mind and said, well, actually, the science doesn't back up that. It can't work. So he invented what he calls a vapograph theory, or the vapograph hypothesis, which we'll look at in the next theory, which is kind of related to gas diffusion hypotheses. But we'll get to that in the next show. He basically laid out his analysis about how some form of direct contact could possibly have accounted for the formation of the bloodstains and partially some of the body images on the shroud. But in the end, he said that direct contact couldn't be the main thesis. It would have to be something else involved, and he came up with his vapograph theory. So here's just a quote from Paul Vignon. He was quoted as saying, quote unquote, "It was obvious from analyzing the shroud photos and from my experiments with direct contact methods that the images were not produced by mere contact alone. For contact between the pliable cloth and the irregular surface of a human body would have caused considerable distortion. And what we find with the Shroud of Turin, there is little to no distortion in the shroud figures." So this was his reason for giving it up. And as we'll find out, a lot of the shroud skeptics that we assessed in the ordinary artistic category, they will capitalize on Paul Vignon's results about distortions, and it can't be direct contact, it can't be Jesus then, because there would be these distortions. So we'll get to the bottom of that as we get to the assessment part. But that said, before we get there, just describing what these methods are. Obviously, there have, subsequent to Paul Vignon, there have been some shroud scientists who've at least tested and or perhaps even endorsed the direct contact hypothesis and tried to scientifically and empirically test to see if it could, in fact, explain the shroud's images. some of these guys are STERP scientists, or what we typically call pro-Shroud scientists, right? So we have to be careful when we're talking about ordinary naturalistic hypotheses. I might refer to them as Shroud skeptics, but in another context, they're actually pro-Shroud. They typically believe in that Jesus, it covered Jesus. It's authentic in terms of being related to Jesus, but they're Shroud skeptics from a Christian perspective in that they think it was just formed naturalistically. It's not a supernatural miracle. It wasn't formed at a resurrection of Jesus or anything like that. So there's a little bit of nuance with some of the people we'll be discussing here. But yeah, let's get familiar with some of the direct contact theses and people that have tested this subsequent to the findings of STERP in 1978. So the first is Sam Pelicore. You heard Gary Habermas mention his name, and he kind of came up with what he called the latent image cellulose degradation theory. This was in and around 1980 to 1981. Now, Sam Pelicore, he was a STERP scientist, and basically he proposed that natural skin substances and the applied burial ointments were transferred to the Shroud cloth through direct contact between the cloth and the underlying decomposing body. Then these substances acted as catalysts to accelerate the degradation of the cellulose itself. And this is similar to what we say with supernatural radiation during the resurrection, right? The color of the body images is due to cellulose degradation. So what Sam Pelicore here is saying in this theory is that, well, it wasn't radiation from the body. It was nothing supernatural. It's just fluid, sweat, and ointments from the dead body itself. They degraded the cellulose of the shroud, creating that yellow to light brown body image coloring in the locations where the cloth made contact with the actual body. And here's a quick quote from Shroud skeptics, atheistic type Shroud skeptics, who proposed, you'll remember them from part 9 and 10, where Randall Barisi and Emily Craig, who did the dusting technique. And they say this about Pelicore and his method, quote unquote, Pelicore used this latent image process and replicated the color and chemical properties of the Turin image better than had other workers. He applied various uncolored substances to linen and heated the fabric. The substances catalyzed cellulose oxidation or dehydration, which produced colored fibers to form the image. Several problems with this process remain, however. Firstly, no sensitizing substance has been detected on the Turin cloth, although it has been recognized that a sensitizing agent substance may have been lost by washing, evaporation, or decomposition. In addition, Pelicore's experiments failed to control the depth of penetration suitably, so that's talking about body image superficiality. Most importantly, his process failed to produce accurate three-dimensional information, which is one of the most important attributes of the Turin cloth. So this is the assessment by Shroud skeptics, people that go for an ordinary artistic method, and they're kind of giving their take very briefly of Pelicore's technique here. Okay, so let's move on. Who else do we have here? Well, we also have another STERP scientist, who I think Gary Habermas mentioned as well, John German, the German technique or method. And this was circa 1978. He came out with this. But yeah, John German was another STERP scientist who proposed a variant version of the direct contact thesis. So the main difference with his version was that his proposal suggested at first only the high points of the body, like the tip of the nose, the things that were touching the cloth were encoded, but then later on, due to the body decomposing, as well as the fact that maybe there was moisture in the air in the tomb or something like that, that the cloth became wetted, and that caused it to sag and to conform more and more to other areas of the body. So in this way, as the body decomposed and as the cloth got wet and began to conform more and more to other parts and make contact with other parts of the body. Thus, more and more of the body images became encoded, and that in turn caused the body images to have differing darker and lighter intensities. That accounts for that three-dimensional information encoded on the shroud based on its image densities and how dark versus light. Obviously the tip of the nose was in contact with the cloth longer, the high points of the body, so those were darker. As the body decomposed and the wet cloth sagged more and got onto lower parts of the bodies, those areas became encoded, but they had contact with the cloth for less time than the tip of the nose or the high points, so they were lighter, and therefore you got this three-dimensional encodation. So that was his theory that John German proposed. Okay, then we also have Dr. Eugenia Natowski, and she came up with her theory, direct contact thesis, which she tested in around 1986. So Dr. Natowski is a Middle Eastern archaeologist, and she's done perhaps more than any other direct contact proponent to test the validity of this type of method. So what she did in 1986, she tried to duplicate the actual conditions that would have applied to Jesus in Jerusalem by experimenting in a tomb complex that was part of the same rock shelf as that found in the Holy Sepulchre. And if you'll remember from my Jesus Mythicism Refuted solo series, part 4, we saw that the Holy Sepulchre is probably the actual location of Jesus' garden tomb. Yeah, she experimented in the same rock shelf there. So the same rocks in Jerusalem, the same similar conditions would apply. And she tested this theory during the Easter season, just to be as accurate to the gospel accounts as possible. And Natowski basically postulated that Jesus, or the man depicted in the shroud if it's not Jesus, would have experienced bloody sweating, and his extreme dehydration from what he went through in his torture and on the cross, that would have raised his internal body temperature, and that would have created acidic conditions in his blood and sweat, in the body of the blood and sweat. So yeah, that's what would ultimately stain the cloth when it came in contact with this acidic substances and that sort of thing. So yeah, she basically took a mannequin, not a real human corpse, obviously. You can't experiment with those unless it's on a body farm, as some STERP scientists have done. Yeah, so they took a mannequin, put these acidic compound fluids of bloody sweat and that sort of thing on it, and put different amounts of embalming substances to different configurations and tested what worked, what didn't. But in the end, no matter what Natowski and her team did, none of the results, as we'll find out when we get to the assessment, none of the results came up with anything remotely close to what we have with the Shroudman images on the Shroud of Turin. So it was an utter failure. It didn't work for Natowski there. Okay, finally, we have our last one, and this is Sebastiano Rodonte technique. And this is ranges 1976 to 1981. Rodonte was coming up with his direct contact theories, and Rodonte, kind of in the same way with Eugenia Natowski, he actually tested his hypothesis or method directly in the field by experimenting with a linen cloth that had been soaked in both water and or in oily solutions of aloes and myrrh, which he then placed over a plaster head. He sprayed that with a bloody sweat solution, like Natowski's, so it would have been acidic. And then he placed them in an underground catacomb in Syracuse, Sicily, for a period of 36 hours. And I have to admit that Rodonte's results were superior to that of what was obtained by Eugenia Natowski in terms of its comparability to the Shroudman images on the Shroud of Turin. But again, they were, as we'll find out when we do our assessment in light of the minimal relevant features, they were still an utter failure and nowhere close to the images we see with the Shroud of Turin. So yeah, I think that kind of lets you know who the main players are. As you can see, it's these direct contact theses didn't really survive the 1980s. Nobody today really believes that they alone could, at least with respect to the body images, at least, that direct contact is able to do the trick. There has to be a different theory or something else involving a dead corpse beyond just mere contact that's at play in terms of creating these images. But nonetheless, let's get into the assessment. Let's find out why didn't these direct contact, simple direct contact mechanism theses or theories survive past the 1980s? What was wrong with them? So, all right, so by way of assessment, our first thing is our first feature. And this includes the fact that the body images are of a high resolution. They have the photographic negativity or quasi-negativity to them, as well as image diffuseness. So how do these theories perform on our first MRF, or minimal relevant feature? And just before I do that, actually, there's one last general point about these direct contact hypotheses that I want to make clear for you guys. So when I'm talking about Shrouds, the typical Shroud skeptics on the internet, so the 8 people that are like, they take an ordinary artistic method, oh, it's just a medieval fake, those kind of hyper Shroud skeptics and that sort of thing who think it's just an artistic image. A lot of times when they're critiquing the Shroud of Turin, trying to prove that it can't be authentic or real or it covered Jesus' body, they'll find critiques that, and I'm going to be using them too. I'll be using Joe Nickel, remember the Shroud skeptic, a hyper skeptic, and that sort of thing. And I'll be using their things, but they'll use critiques of the direct contact hypothesis, which prove that, you know, it couldn't have just been formed naturalistically by direct contact with the body, the cloth between the cloth and the body alone. And they'll say, well, that proves that it never covered a shroud. It must be, it never covered Jesus, or it must have been a fake, an artistic fake, or something like that. But no, I mean, we're Christians. We believe that the fact that these criticisms that we're going to be looking at in the assessment disprove or falsify that it was formed through direct contact mechanisms alone, that helps the case of the Christian, because that rules out an ordinary naturalistic mechanism. But that doesn't mean that it's artistic. We Christians say that it was supernaturally formed. There are other mechanisms, right? Radiation, stuff like that, or light, or there are other ordinary naturalistic mechanisms outside of direct contact that we need to get to and evaluate as well. So a lot of times lay Shroud skeptics they just do like a quick Google search or something, and that's what T-Jump did when I talked to him about the Shroud. He just went on Wikipedia and he found little simple criticisms whereby it kind of rules out, well, it couldn't have been formed naturalistically through direct contact, and then he thinks, see, that proves it was an artistic fake. No, in the first place, there are other ordinary naturalistic mechanisms outside of just mere direct contact that you've got to deal with. But additionally, even if there weren't, remember, Christians say it was formed supernaturally through some other, perhaps radiation or light or electromagnetism or whatever, at the time of the resurrection. It was formed supernaturally. So these critiques of the direct contact hypothesis don't falsify the Christian worldview that this thing is a miraculously formed image in any way. It just helps our case, proving that we know for a fact it wasn't formed naturalistically through direct contact. So just be aware of that. As I'm going through the assessment and coming up with these critiques, you might hear Shroud, atheists or lay Shroud skeptics who just assume it's an artistic image, and they'll throw some of these at you and say, well, see, that proves it didn't cover Jesus, or that it never covered a human body or something like that. No, that's not true, right? I mean, there are other ways that this thing covered the corpse of Jesus, and through the resurrection, it created these images either supernaturally, or perhaps there are other naturalistic mechanisms that we need to look at and assess to see if those might work. So yeah, I just wanted you to be aware of that. If you encounter that in your talks or when you're evangelizing someone and sharing the Shroud evidence with them, if they throw a critique like that against the direct contact naturalistic hypothesis, that doesn't necessarily rule out that there was was formed by covering a body of Jesus or has anything to do with the resurrection. So just make sure you're careful about that. Okay, so back to MFR number 1. How do the direct contact hypotheses or mechanisms fare in that regard? Okay, so in terms of the photographic negativity and or quasi-negativity, if you go for that counter feature, all of these methods seem to account for this. They get a green check mark. They can account for the negativity of the image. However, when it comes to the high resolution of the body image, remember the shroud, and it's been quantifiably scientifically proven to a very fine degree. I mentioned in part 4 what that quantity is, or something, but you can see very fine details on the Shroud of Turin. It's very high resolution. Unfortunately, all of the methods except for one utterly failed this, and well, actually all of the methods together in terms of the experimental results that were obtained, they all failed to reproduce the high resolution. So let me just explain this. So basically, the experiment by Sam Pelicore, it resulted in a totally distorted image. It lacked high resolution in any way. It bared scant resemblance to a real human being, unlike the Shroud images. So especially problematic was the facial region that Pelicore got using his method. In addition to that, the torso and other body regions were not, quote unquote, not formed well. And this is according to Pelicore himself. So this was just an utter failure on the high resolution for Pelicore. Similarly, Natowski and Rodonte, Sebastiano Rodonte's experimental results, a little bit better than Pelicore, but they didn't fare that much better compared to Pelicore. So, for example, Natowski's work only demonstrated that even with trying different variations of her technique, would be of no benefit with respect to trying to get reproduce the high resolution of the Shroud images. None of her images, regardless of what variation in her technique she tried, produced a similar high resolution Shroud of Turin image that resembled a real human being with almost photographic level quality, like we see with the Shroud Man on the Shroud of Turin. And while Rodonte's resultant images were a little bit superior to Natowski's, again, none of his images were in any way comparable to what we have with the Shroud of Turin, with the perfectly shadowed, highly focused, and finely resolved images on the Shroud of Turin that we see. Now, with Dr. John German's technique, on the other hand, while the other three methods I give absolute failures to, with John German's method, I give a questionable status. So I think it's possible. I don't give a green check mark for German's technique, but I give it a yellow question mark. Talking about my Excel spreadsheet on my blog site for those that don't understand what I'm talking about, but I give it a questionable status as to whether German's technique could account for the high resolution images on the Shroud, because quote unquote, it is possible that the linen was originally stiff, similar to a starched shirt, and that it gradually sagged closer to the body as it became softer in the tomb. And this has been proposed by John German, a member of STURP, and would account for how the cloth got close enough to produce a high-resolution images. So, thus, in my research, I found that some pro-shroud experts reluctantly concede that it is possible under ideal conditions, and note that it's under ideal conditions, that they might be able to reproduce the relatively high-resolution image. But that said, in order to do so, you have to understand it's a very high level of fine-tuning that's required here. And someone might argue, Mark Antionacci, I think, argues that this is highly improbable to occur in the tomb. So, German, it's interesting because German never published photos of his results, his experimental results, for verification. But we basically know scientifically that linen is a highly elastic cellulosic fiber, which can retain its shape far better than most other fabrics. And in that case, it would require extreme fine-tuning conditions for the soaked or wet linen cloth in order to conform precisely to all the areas of the body in the precise way that would be required to produce the undistorted, highly resolved images that we find on the Shroud of Turin. And yeah, such a postulation that's extremely ad hoc, perhaps you might even argue it's extremely improbable to occur, or that's a presumption that's unprovable. Again, I always assume in favor of the Shroud skeptic and against my theory, so I gave it a questionable status, but I think given the need for the fine-tunedness of German's postulation here, it's only under extremely fine-tuned ideal conditions that this technique would even be able to reproduce the Shroud's high-resolution images. So that's very questionable, if not outright implausible or improbable. But again, in favor of the Shroud skeptic, so I give it a questionable status here. Okay, so what about the next minimal relevant feature in terms of body image uniformity? Well, in terms of the uniformity of the images, all direct contact methods utterly fail to account for the body image uniformity in terms of the density aspect. Because think about it, all of these methods dictate that gravity is operating on the weight of a human body, a dead corpse. And therefore, any proposed decomposition liquids, embalming oils, alone would inevitably leave noticeable differences in the image intensities between the dorsal and frontal images. But yet this is not observed on the Shroud. Remember, we said that apart from the face or whatever, that the backside and the front side, the dorsal and the frontal images, have the exact same image darknesses or densities. So that's called body image density uniformity. That's what I call it. But that's not what we would expect. If it was due to direct contact, the dorsal image should be much darker because gravity is pressing down. That body's laying on the backside of the Shroud and gravity's pushing that down. So it should be darker and more contact than the frontal image, which would be lighter because, it's sitting on top of the body and touching the body that way. So just from the weight of the body, we would these techniques automatically fail body image uniform densities. But as well, with these, if you're positing bloody sweat or sweat and decomposition liquids and embalming oils and on all this that stain the cloth to make the images, this would create problem with the body image uniform intensity. Remember, every single fibril is colored the exact same amount, no more, no less. It's no darker or no lighter than any other fibril. And these fibrils are smaller than the diameter of a human hair that make up the threads in the Shroud. This is scientifically impossible for any direct contact method to do. I mean, some parts of the body would be pressing more, especially given the body's position with one upraised leg. Some parts of the body would be pressing more heavily on the cloth, and certain fibrils would inevitably have a higher intensity of color than others, but that's not what we have with the Shroud. So it's an absolute failure on this front. And again, it's also, even though this isn't an MRF, because the direct contact thesis gives me that there's a human body. Remember, I mentioned that there's also substance uniformity in that both the hair, different substances, hair and skin, are encoded on the Shroud. And I said that's not a minimal relevant feature because that kind of begs the question against ordinary artistic techniques that posit a statue or something like that are all just made of one substance. But that's not a problem here. This direct contact theses give me a human body. So there are different substances. There's hair encoded, there's skin, and if you believe that there's coins and other stuff in there, but minimally, there's hair and skin that's encoded on the Shroud of Turin. And we know that a direct contact thesis encoding mechanism would not operate uniformly in terms of hair versus the body or that sort of thing. So it fails the substance uniformity aspect in that case as well. Finally, in terms of cylindrical uniformity, so remember, that's not a minimal relevant feature, not even given direct contact hypotheses. because we need to do more work to confirm that it's uniform throughout the cylindrical outside of each fibril. The 360 degrees around every fibril is colored. That's not a minimal relevant feature, so I'm not going to hold that against direct contact theses. Again, I always help out the Shroud skeptic and go against my theory whenever possible. But just as a side note, just so you know, if cylindrical uniformity of the intensity of color around the cylindrical surface is ever proven to be true, all of these methods, direct contact hypotheses, utterly fail to account for that. Because think about it, this entire cylindrical 360 degrees cylindrical surface of each and every fiber is not in direct contact with the body. It's only the side that's touching his body, the front part of each fibril that would be touching him. The back part would be left totally not in contact with the body, and therefore should be not colored at all. But again, if this fact were ever proven to be true, then this would falsify all direct contact theses right away, or mechanisms right away. But since it's not an MRF, I'm just noting that. We're not going to hold it against it. So, all right, great. So let's move on. What about the third minimal relevant feature? And this is the three-dimensional nature, the topographic information encoded on the shroud, the fact that it gives us 3D, quote-unquote, 3D images. Well, in the first place, if we have an unmanipulated cloth, such as Pelicore's thesis or Vinian or something, where the cloth isn't wetted or manipulated in any way, and it's just a natural drape over a human being, it's impossible, scientifically impossible for these methods to account for the three-dimensional images on the shroud. Because think about it, we kind of mentioned this with some of the ordinary artistic mechanisms, like a bas relief or statue or something like that. There are these non-contact zones that just wouldn't be in touch. Only the areas that are encoded by the natural drape of a cloth would be encoded as body images on the Shroud of Turin, right? You wouldn't get the lower cheeks, you just get the tip of the nose, maybe the top of the knee, but there are, based on the body position, there are areas that wouldn't be touching, at least on the frontal image, at the very least on the frontal image alone, let alone the back image, given there's a raised leg and stuff like that. But there are certain parts that would not be in direct contact with an unmanipulated natural cloth draped over a human body. And these areas, it would be all or nothing. They wouldn't be encoded at all, and you wouldn't get this true three-dimensional data resulting from that. So, utter failure there. But what about the manipulated hypotheses, right? We've got John German and that, where they posit either a wet cloth or a decomposing body, so that over time the cloth conforms more and more with lower parts of the body that wouldn't have been in contact with the cloth originally, but over time they become in contact and stuff like that. So in the first place, this is highly ad hoc and implausible. I would say that it just happened to do that. It would have to be extremely fine-tuned in order to arrive at the three-dimensional results and as it conformed to the body. But beyond that, other credible pro-Shroud STURP scientists, Dr. John Jackson, Eric Jumper, Erkeline, they actually tested whether, through using external pressure to press the areas that wouldn't be in contact with the body, and made sure that all the proper areas would be in contact with that. And they performed certain scientific experiments to see, well, what would happen if through external pressure or through a wet cloth or whatever mechanism, the cloth was pressed or made to conform to all the areas of the body. And they found, quote unquote, such binary characteristics pose a fundamental problem with this type of process, for such a mechanism doesn't provide the latitude to correlate intensity with a continuum of relief variations. What's more, these STURP scientists, as they press the cloth down onto the non-contact areas using external pressure, they found that, hang on, let me just find quote unquote, the process would only produce even more distorted facial images, for example. So things got even worse in terms of high resolution when pressure was applied to conform the cloth and that sort of thing. So if it was wet or whatever the person, as the cloth conforms to the body, to the lower areas of the body, like the cheek, under the nose, stuff like that, this just produces even more distorted images. So yeah, it's highly improbable that, if not impossible, that any and all direct contact methods would be able to produce the 3D continuous full images of the three-dimensional or tridimensional shroud images that we have, especially in terms of the frontal images where we don't have gravity pushing down the body and that sort of thing. But even with the dorsal images, I mean, we can tell that that body has an upraised leg, so parts of the leg wouldn't be encoded properly and that sort of thing. And that's what we find with the shroud, right? One of the thighs is thinner than a normal thigh, and that's due to the tenting effect and that sort of thing. So yeah, this is just an utter failure in terms of that feature. And as we said, with feature 4, it can't account for these continuous full-length body images without some kind of external pressure or wetness or decomposing body to make the cloth conform and touch the rest of the body. But when you do that, that results in more distorted images, doesn't give you high resolution or three-dimensional images. So that's a problem with all these methods there. Okay, so what about minimal relevant feature number 4? We've already kind of covered that about the non-contact zones, right? There are continuous shroud images on both the frontal and dorsal images. That's scientifically impossible with an unmanipulated, naturally draped cloth to occur. So there had to be some kind of external pressure or some kind of mechanism that conformed the cloth to all the areas of the shroud. And some people like John German and that do try to come up with theories to account for that. Now, the real Achilles heel that a lot of pro-shroud scientists against naturalistic hypotheses, or shroud skeptics of the atheist variety, a lot of lay shroud skeptics, for example, Alan, in a lot of my debates with him, or Tyler B. from the SNS boards, they would bring up the vertically mapped wrapping distortions, or the wraparound effect. I think this is in one of my Shroud Wars debates versus Alan, the Shroud skeptic there, and he brought up what's called this wraparound effect. And this is also brought up by other Shroud skeptics that are, experts in the field or that sort of thing. Like, for example, Joe Nickell back in 1986. I have a video of him in the sources where he kind of mentions this wraparound effect, and he says, look, it's scientifically impossible for a direct contact mechanism to explain the vertically mapped wrapping distortions. There would be inevitable two-dimensional lateral distortions. So for example, you'll see on your YouTube screens the Mask of Agamemnon, that flattened out pancake of a face, because if it was wrapped around a face, well, then the cloth would be touching all parts of the body, including the sides of the face and that sort of thing, so that would become encoded. And when you laid the shroud out flat, that widens the face and looks like a flattened mask, or it looks like your face has been squashed into a pancake, and it widens out. You can see that on your YouTube screen with the Mask of Agamemnon effect, the ancient Greek of the king of Mycenae, or supposed king of Mycenae, who had that mask, and that's supposed to represent him. And we would see that on the Shroud of Turin, obviously. If the cloth was wrapped around his face and it was formed by direct contact, and then we flatten out the sheet, well, we're going to have that flattened out face, and that's called the wraparound effect. So it's scientifically impossible, they'll say. STIRP scientists have demonstrated that this would be inconsistent with these two-dimensional lateral distortions would be apparent. So it couldn't have been formed naturalistically by being wrapped around a person's head. There would be this flattened out face, but instead we don't get that. We get a realistic human-looking face, true to what he would look like in real life and that sort of thing. And there's, like I said, there's been tons of Shroud skeptics ranging from Joe Nickell to Alan, and this is a common one, or critique, that people say automatically rules out direct contact theses. And in fact, it was this single fact, I think, that's the main Achilles heel that really ruled it out in the 1980s. That said, I want to give another side, because more recently, a Shroud skeptic, Colin Berry, he claims that he's demonstrated scientifically that Well, believe it or not, there isn't necessarily an obvious wraparound effect through direct contact imprints coming from, a very small template or a perfect cylinder or that sort of thing. So long as certain precise conditions are met, and that's sort of the nuanced qualification that where he gets out of it. But this is a controversial area. This is Colin Berry's claims. He claims that he's been able to prove that actually the wraparound effect wouldn't be a problem for it. But like I said, it's controversial. Thibaut Heimberger counters that, and he says, look, in the light of the research conducted by various scientists on actual life-sized human-shaped objects, achieving such results would be ambiguous at best or questionable at best when applied to full life-size scales. So that's the issue. Colin Berry does it on little toys and stuff like that to test his thing, and he, under precise conditions, he can get images that, according to him and in his pictures, don't seem to have this wraparound effect. But that wouldn't, Heimberger's saying, yeah, but that wouldn't apply on a full-size human being. This wraparound effect would inevitably happen if we tested it on a human being-sized object or something like that. So that's sort of the debatable aspect. For me, it doesn't matter either way, because regardless, when it comes to these vertically mapped wrapping distortions, regardless of the wraparound effect, it's still almost impossible, if not extremely improbable, that the entirety of the Shroud's vertically mapped wrapping distortions, remember, the images look like the cloth was somewhat flattened and then the images were encoded straight line vertically or curvilinear, like a curveball in baseball, onto the cloth or the cloth straight down into, whatever the image encoding thing was. So it wasn't bent or it wasn't just naturally draped. It's almost like the cloth kind of straightened out and then vertically was encoded. The body parts were vertically encoded in some way that way. And that would be impossible, regardless of whether there's a wraparound effect that's inevitable or not. It's scientifically improbable, if not impossible, extremely improbable, that all of these vertically mapped wrapping distortions would be able to be encoded through a direct contact mechanism where the cloth would just be directly in contact with the body and it would be in all sorts of configurations. And, if you press down through external pressure or as the cloth conforms to the human body through wetness or decomposition or whatever, it's going to be including horizontal or lateral distortions. It's not going to just be encoded in a vertical path, because think about it. When the cloth gets pressed down on your nose, I'll include a picture from John Jackson. You can see the encodation paths, P and that sort of thing, where it's a straight line versus going out sideways or horizontally, right? So yeah, you'll look at the article and you'll see what I'm talking about, but it's impossible for these to be the case through a direct contact hypothesis. So yeah, just kind of quoting the STIRP experts here, quote unquote, the two-dimensional distortions from a contact image formation mechanism are different from those obtained from a vertical mapping phenomenon, as we have with the Shroud of Turin. Additionally, if left unmanipulated, so they're talking about the cloth, if that was unmanipulated and didn't conform to the body, then direct contact methods are by definition incapable of encoding images where the body doesn't contact the cloth. Unless, of course, one transforms these non-contact zones into contact areas by pressing down on the cloth via some sort of external pressure and or postulating a wet, sagging cloth, or a decomposing body where the cloth falls more and more down onto the lower parts. And that conforms to every single region of the underlying body equally, such as the sides of the nose or the eye sockets, for example. It's just simply impossible to account for these vertically mapped wrapping distortions in total. It just couldn't happen. Okay, we have one final aspect under our minimal relevant feature number 4 that's relevant here, and that's the fact that no body side images or sides of the face have been encoded on the Shroud Man, on the Shroud of Turin. It's strictly just vertical, the front and the back. The body sides are just blank. They were not encoded at all. Any part of the side of the body or the face or anything like that. Now, some Barry Schwartz, for example, or Ray Rogers, some pro Shroud, in the sense that they're thinking the Shroud is authentic in that sort of way, will kind of say, well, maybe the body side images weren't encoded because they didn't make contact with the cloth. Well, how could that be? The natural drape cloth, it would go over the sides, and you would get that wraparound, might get that wraparound effect, or it would definitely encode the body sides, right? Well, they'll say, well, maybe the cloth was propped up away from the sides of the cloth. Remember in the Gospels, it talks about them bringing oil, spices, bundles, flowers, stuff like that, and maybe that propped the cloth away from the sides of the body, just the way they happened to put it. And that's why the body sides weren't encoded, and that could be a way of preserving the direct contact hypothesis. Obviously, Barry Schwartz isn't a direct contact proponent, but I'm just saying this is part of a theory that he has in his own naturalistic view as a possibility, and it could be applied to the direct contact hypothesis as a way to explain why the sides of the body or the face haven't been encoded. However, this is improbable, I would say, to be true as an explanation, because it would be very improbable to achieve the precision that's needed to preserve the anatomical correctness of the body images that we have, while at the same time not encoding any part of the sides of the body at all on the cloth. Maybe you just made a mistake. I mean, you're not a machine. You can't precisely put the spices in the exact spots so that none of the body sides are encoded. You might get a little piece of a body side, or a part of the side was encoded while other parts weren't, or something. So it kind of seems improbable given this fine-tuning aspect. At least some parts of the body sides should have been encoded. It doesn't seem... it's very ad hoc. Let's just say that they all put these bundles and spices and stuff in such a precise way as to ensure that not a single part of the body sides were encoded, and it was precisely just the vertically mapped frontal and dorsal parts of the body that were encoded. I don't know, that seems a little ad hoc to me. But what's even worse, when we come to the facial regions, the blood stains on the head region, they are consistent with the cloth being wrapped entirely around the head. So we know for a fact at one point, given the blood stains, these blood stains had to form while the shroud was wrapped around the entire head at some point. But yet there's no side images of the head. Well, what are you going to say? They wrapped it around his head and then unwrapped it or something before it had enough time? Wouldn't there be any coloring? It just seems very ad hoc to say that, well, it was wrapped around his head, but then they unwrapped it in sufficient amount of time to prevent those sides of his face from being encoded on the shroud through the bloody sweat or whatever it was. And even had the blood been deposited first and then the cloth was unwrapped, as I'm saying, and then placed on top of the face without wrapping, at least some discoloration should still be expected to occur from even this brief contact, especially if the blood, as Natowski and Rodonte said, had acidic components to it, given what Jesus had been through and that sort of thing. Then the problem would be even more pronounced there. Despite the brief contact, there would still be some discoloration that would take place. So yeah, I think that it's improbable here. I know that the Shroud skeptic Colin Berry, again, he's claimed to produce images that lack body sides by applying vertical pressure on his toy figurines that are covered with the cloth. So, but I don't know. Yeah, such methods don't really seem to be applicable to a real life human corpse being wrapped in a full length burial cloth that we have here, right? This seems improbable. So maybe Colin Berry's right, and you can get this by applying this vertical pressure to a toy, and that prevents body side images, but that doesn't seem to be applicable to a human body. I mean, the similar forces, you probably have to squish the body, end up squishing the body or something like that, just to avoid encoding body side images. So it seems very improbable that even though Colin Berry has this kind of qualification, it only applies to the world of toys, where, you know, they're hard, they don't squish easy with comparable forces, and, you know, you can do that kind of thing. So yeah, I don't see how it would apply to a human body to get out of this. So yeah, these methods all fail on the no body side images. I think that at least part of the body side images would be encoded, and at the very least, definitely there would be some discoloration around the sides of the head that should be visible. Yeah, that's my take on that. Okay, so let's move on to the minimal relevant feature number 5. So this is where we have, it's non-saturated, it's not as dark or colored as it could be, the body images. There's no cementation or capillary flow, no liquid like paint or something in between the fibers, and it's body image superficiality on the 3 levels, the fabric, thread, and fibril levels. So how do these methods do on that front? So they basically, all of them fail, some even worse than others, but all of them fail to attribute for all 3 aspects of this minimal relevant feature. In the first place, you know, the body, especially if the body's wet with embalming oils and various alloys and myrrh or whatever it is, and bloody sweat and blood, all of these would, just like with the bloodstains on the shroud, they would penetrate deep inside the shroud. You would find evidence of some cementation or capillary flow. Some areas of the body image that were closer, you know, more in contact with the shroud than others, depending on what thesis you have. If it's just naturally draped or it's a wet cloth, these problems would be even further compounded. But you would have some body images that it would be all fully saturated under the direct contact hypothesis. You know, some areas would be wetter than others, and it would fully saturate. It would be, the body images in some parts would be as fully dark as they could possibly be, and therefore not be uniform. Because, I mean, think of the difference between the back, the dorsal, and the frontal image. Again, those effects of gravity. The dorsal images wouldn't be superficial in any way, at the fabric level or the thread level, let alone the fibril level. So, yeah, these are just an utter failure for every attempt, and it just gets worse if you have the John German or Rodonte type postulations and stuff like that, like where the body, you know, the cloth itself is wet and or is pressed to the body to get those non-contact zones. That's just going to make it even more improbable that's what happened in terms of accounting for these aspects of this minimal relevant feature of the Shroud of Turin's body images. They would not be superficial, some areas would be saturated, and there would definitely be evidence of cementation or capillary flow of the various liquids on the body found on the shroud, but yet none of that is on the Shroud of Turin's images. So it's impossible scientifically for this mechanism to be the explanation of the Shroud of Turin. Utter failure on that front. And it, like I said, it's even, the problems are further compounded with German and Rodonte's versions of these theories here. All right, so let's move on to the next minimal relevant feature with several aspects. So this is about the condition of the shroud man in the shroud, though those anatomical accuracies. Remember, there's also the no decomposition or putrefaction. So far in all of our ordinary artistic theses, this no decomposition or putrefaction liquids in sufficient quantities to account for the body stain images was totally irrelevant to the artistic mechanisms. Well, now starting with the direct contact theses as our first direct contact mechanisms as our first part of an ordinary naturalistic hypothesis, now that's going to be relevant and disprove these theories here. And then finally we have a really important part. We're going to spend a lot of time on the bloodstain images or body fluid properties of the Shroud of Turin, because as I kind of mentioned when I covered Walter Macrone's theory in part 7 and 8, I think it's in part 7 specifically, where, look, there's only two mechanisms or possibly three mechanisms to account for the encoding of the bloodstains on the Shroud of Turin. The first is by it's painted in some way. And we showed that that's scientifically impossible to be the case. Even if you posit that he painted with real blood, it just couldn't account for all the properties. The second is right here, direct contact. And this is what most Shroud experts who don't believe that it's proof of a miraculous image, this is what they go for, including people like Barry Schwartz and Ray Rogers, some STERP scientists. They think that it was just encoded through direct contact. I disagree with that. I'll explain my reasons why. Also, Teddy Pappas, who's been on the show before, this is what she's working on currently with research to prove that the bloodstains couldn't have been encoded through direct contact naturalistically. In a way, I won't reveal her research on that. Hopefully when that comes out, I'll have her on the show and we can discuss it. But that's it. There's just these two mechanisms. If it's painting or it was encoded on the Shroud through direct contact, or there's a third alternative, which is a hybrid. It was both direct contact and some painting. So again, since we falsified that painting couldn't have accounted for the bloodstains at all, not even in part, so we know the combination theory's out. This is really the last thing you have left, is direct contact. The bloodstains were encoded onto the Shroud through directly coming into contact with the cloth, and I'm going to spend some time on this option, falsifying this, and then that's it for the bloodstains. You don't have an ordinary artistic or naturalistic hypothesis to explain them left. Let's get straight into it. Let's start off with the anatomical accuracies aspect. Okay, so in terms of anatomical accuracies, I just gave this all green check marks for all these methods. Obviously, they all posit a real anatomically correct human body that has been wounded. Some even go so far as to say, well, that was even Jesus who was crucified and that sort of thing. So I just gave it easy green check marks. All of the direct contact theses can account for the anatomical accuracies. One thing to note here that's really important is, as part of the anatomical accuracies, there's body rigidity. That's a scientifically proven fact. For example, we can see that in the buttocks of the Shroud Man and that sort of thing, where there's this rigidity. And since direct contact hypotheses or mechanisms don't say, oh, it's a statue or a bas-relief or something like that has inherent rigidity, and it says, no, this is a dead human body that created the images through direct contact, well, what would explain the rigidity that's been proven in the Shroud Man and is particularly demonstrable and scientifically proven with the buttocks, for example, and that sort of thing, and other areas where there's this rigidity evident? Oh, rigor mortis. This is proof, interesting proof, that the body images must have been formed while the human body was in a state of rigor mortis, and that happens very soon. Just like Jesus, he was resurrected on the third day, which wasn't even full 24-hour periods. It was less than that, because the Jewish accounting of days and stuff like that, part of a day equals counts as a day and stuff like that. That's how the ancient Jews of Jesus' day would count it. So there's no problem there. That was 3 days, but that's even shorter. So it's a very short amount of time that these images were formed, and hypothetically the body vacated the Shroud. And that's what we get with the next aspect here, that there's no decomposition or putrefaction liquids found on the Shroud of Turin in sufficient quantity to explain the encodation of the body images on the Shroud of Turin. If the direct contact thesis was true, there was a dead corpse and, it was oiled up, it had all these embalming oils and stuff like myrrh and aloes and all of that, plus bloody sweat, and this is contact with these acidic liquids, decomposition liquids, as the body decayed and decomposed. That's what stained the cloth to create these body images. Well, surely we would expect to find some trace residual amounts of these postulated decomposition liquids on the Shroud of Turin. Unfortunately, STERP, scientifically proven fact, peer-reviewed literature. My friends, we have no such traces that have been detected to be present on the Shroud images today, insufficient quantities to account for the body images. So unlike gas diffusion methods, which we're going to look at next time, they don't have to necessarily postulate that there's actual decomposition of the body taking place and that sort of thing, but direct contact hypotheses do. So especially if you postulate, the body was wet with various embalming liquids and fluids and stuff like that, and in John German's, the cloth itself was wet, adding to this problem where it would conform to the body and pick up these decomposition liquids. So what's interesting here is that this proves that not only were the body images formed very short period of time when the body was in a state of rigor mortis still, which could only last for a few days at most, but at most, the body must have been removed before decomposition liquids started. The body decayed to a point where it was, creating residual traces of decomposition liquids that we would find prior to its removal, the body's removal from the Shroud of Turin. Oh, Jesus, he rose on the third day before he would have decayed to that point, and then all of a sudden he was taken out of the shroud. He formed the images in rigor mortis. The images were formed in rigor mortis, this body, and the body was removed somehow from the shroud in time before sufficient quantities of decomposition liquids for the images to be formed in that way took place or were deposited onto the shroud. So the body was removed very quickly, within days, and scientists have studied this, especially if we're assuming Jerusalem and stuff like that. Very short period of time, a few days at most, several days at most, depending on the conditions that the body was in. Again, for our minimal relevant features approach, we can't assume it was Jesus in Jerusalem with a hot climate in a tomb and stuff like that. But either way, it no matter what the conditions, it puts a very short matter of days or less in terms of when the body had to be removed, with the images already formed and or formed at that moment upon removal. Definitely for Christians, we're grinning ear to ear saying, yep, resurrection. That's when the body left. The images were formed at the moment of the resurrection, when Jesus' body was still rigid from rigor mortis, or having some effects of rigor mortis and that sort of thing. That fits. Perfect. Gospels confirmed. So that's just a bonus. We don't, for the minimal relevant features approach, obviously we're not going to go that far. But what is a fact is, well, look, this body had some elements of rigidity in it. What else could that be? It sounds like rigor mortis. I mean, what else would it be? And it was removed before sufficient decomposition liquids were deposited onto the shroud or built up to the point where a direct contact thesis would do its thing. These liquids would stain the cloth or do what they're, if it's an acidic compound, degrade the cellulose of the shroud. I assigned a questionable status for this decomposition liquid, just because it is theoretically possible under ideal conditions that the image was formed through direct contact, and somehow the human body was removed from the cloth before any signs of decomposition could set in. Again, though, if it was removed in that time, though, the liquids wouldn't be able to form to the point. Would it be able to form to the point where it created the Shroud of Turin's body images as we see them today? At least not without leaving behind some trace residual elements that would be detectable to scientists today. Obviously, over time, a lot of that would decay or decompose or oxidize and stuff like that, and we would lose that. But nonetheless, there would have to be a sufficient amount whereby we would expect to see residual traces that would be scientifically observable today using the instruments that these STURP scientists use, and yet nothing, not a trace, it's not there, decomposition. Liquids and that in terms of residual traces. So that's just impossible. If these direct contact mechanisms were responsible for creating the Shroud Man's body images. I don't know. It's questionable. I doubt it. but we'll give it a questionable status because, again, as we said kind of before, even with brief contact, that will still create at least some kind of discoloration and that sort of thing. So, yeah, it all depends on doing the numbers. Would there or would there not have been enough if you remove the body within 3 days or something like that from the shroud? Would that have been enough time to create the coloring as we see on the shroud today? All right. So yeah, with that said, let's move on to the most important part: the blood stains and body fluid properties of the Shroud of Turin. How does this direct contact mechanisms do on this front? Okay, and actually, before I get into that, I do want to just cover very quickly an assessment of the direct contact mechanisms in relation to minimal relevant feature number 7, the final one on additional features, just because there's 2 quick ones that apply to the direct contact thesis, and then we'll get into our full assessment of the bloodstain analysis, which will be a very comprehensive. But the first one is additional feature number 3, which proves that the color of the body images on the Shroud of Turin through photomicrographs and samples have demonstrated conclusively that the image's color is a result of concentrations of yellow to light brown fibers. Now, with the direct contact techniques, some of them can produce similar image colors found to the Shroud of Turin. However, Sebastiano Rodonte's technique, those resulted in images that were described as being brown to sepia in color, or dark brown. That's another word for dark brown, and that's inconsistent with the color that we find on the Shroud of Turin based on staining. So in terms of direct contacts, Sebastiano Rodonte's technique would fail additional feature number 3 in terms of the color, whereas the other ones were similar enough to it. Finally, additional feature number 6. This is where microchemical evaluation has indicated that there's no evidence, zip, duda, bubkiss, evidence for any spices or oils, nor any other biochemical / organic substances that are known to be produced and or associated with a human body, either in life or in death. And this obviously contradicts all of the direct contact theses that say that, well, through direct contact and there is bloody sweat or sweat and some sort of played a role in creating the images. And we know from various spectral tests that I covered in parts 4 and 5 that various spectral tests conducted by Stirp on the Shroud of Turin, we know that none of these compounds were proven to be on the shroud at all in sufficient quantities. There was no sweat, no alloys, no myrrh, no embalming substances. None of the substances hypothesized to be involved in creating the images in these direct contact theories have been discovered to be present on the shroud, not even in residual trace amounts. And that would be scientifically impossible to be the case if these direct contact hypotheses were true. At the very least, it's extremely highly unlikely that all such traces would have been completely oxidized or degraded in their entirety. Now, it's important to note that this finding doesn't disprove that the shroud, in fact, did cover Jesus' dead corpse and that sort of thing. It's just saying that with respect to the direct contact mechanisms at this point, these are falsified because there would have to be a certain amount of these substances on whereby we would expect there to be residual traces. So if that amount required to create the images through a direct contact mechanism were not present on the body at the time it was covered, on Jesus' body, and therefore didn't play a role in creating the body images at all, then we wouldn't expect to find residual trace elements. So it doesn't necessarily falsify that it covered Jesus' dead corpse and was formed during the resurrection of Jesus supernaturally or miraculously in some way. It's just, right now, we're just falsifying the direct contact theses, and perhaps this will apply to gas diffusion and some other ordinary naturalistic mechanisms that require sufficient amounts of these substances, these oils or sweat or blood bloody sweat and embalming substances, stuff like this, myrrh, alloys. The fact that we don't find any of those, it just falsifies those. Either the body had very little of those substances applied to it, or, as some pro-Shroud experts say, perhaps because they were in a rush to bury Jesus, they didn't have time to cover his body, and that's why the women were coming. They put the spices and that in block form and left before sundown and that sort of thing on the Sabbath, before Passover and Sabbath and that. And then they were returning Sunday morning to finish the job in terms of putting on the embalming substances and stuff like that. So, or finally, maybe they did cover him with all the necessary oils and embalming substances and alloys and all of that. And all of those were there in sufficient quantity to leave residual traces today, but those were dissolved supernaturally at the time of the resurrection. Something supernaturally removed them so that we don't detect them today. There's lots of ways that pro-Shroud or Christians can say that, well, the Shroud definitely covered the dead corpse of Jesus' body and that sort of thing, despite the fact that we don't find any residual trace elements of any embalming oils or alloys or, decomposition liquids or something like that, or sweat in sufficient quantities or residual traces that would have been played a part in terms of creating the body images and that sort of thing. Yeah, it solely just disproves that, naturalistically speaking, these substances weren't present in sufficient amount of qualities to produce the body images naturalistically through direct contact mechanisms. That's all that's proven through this additional feature. Just to make that clear, I hope that is clear. All right, cool. So let's move on to the bloodstains then. So in terms of the bloodstains, as I mentioned, when we assessed Walter McCroney's traditional painting hypothesis, there are only two possible mechanisms that could account for how the bloodstains became encoded on the Shroud of Turin. That's one, through a traditional painting technique. A painter painted them on with a traditional painting brush or some kind of instrument that was small enough to create very fine and precise bloodstains. Either they painted with paint or real blood. For all intents and purposes, it's proven beyond all reasonable doubt that it is, in fact, real blood. We don't know if it's human blood or animal blood. We can't prove that yet, but we can prove that it is real blood. Again, I was bending over backwards to help out atheists and skeptics, so I said, look, I'm not even going to include that it is real blood as a minimal relevant feature. I don't need to assume that to make my case, so I just left it an open question. But for your sake, as the audience, just understand it is a minimal relevant feature that this is real blood. So if it was painting, they had to paint using real blood and take special measures to make sure it wouldn't coagulate as they painted. Or the second method is through direct contact. The cloth touches the bloody body and the blood stains become encoded onto the cloth. The only other third option is a combination of both. Maybe some of the blood stains were encoded through direct contact, and then the artist painted other blood stains or filled in the gaps or something like that of some of the blood stains. So that's it. That's all the atheist or Shroud skeptic has at their disposal to explain how the bloodstains got on there naturalistically. There's literally no other way that people can think of or that have thought of to come up with it, to explain it. Just by way of kind of review, in part 7, I provided various reasons as to why I think we should rule out the pure painting method. So just positing that the bloodstains were painted, whether with paint or with real blood. And I gave that there is various reasons to rule this out. So in the first place, one of the most important findings is that there are no minimal relevant features, is that there are no body images underneath the bloodstains, nor the invisible serum retraction rings that we only found out about in the 20th century through ultraviolet illumination and spectral imaging equipment that are there. Thereby proving that it is in fact real blood. So the body images terminate precisely. They don't breach or damage even at a microscopic level. They don't overlap the bloodstains. The body images terminate precisely at the boundaries of those invisible serum retraction rings and blood stains. There's no penetration or overlapping or anything like that. And that causes a lot of problems for Shroud skeptics in terms of painting in the first place. So it's based on the fact that there's no body images that a lot of Shroud experts believe that the bloodstains must have been encoded first on the Shroud of Turin. And then for one reason or whatever the mechanisms were that produced the body images, they were inhibited or blocked by the bloodstains being present. And that's why there's no body images underneath the bloodstains that were already present. There are some Shroud skeptics who want to say, no, the body images were formed first and then the bloodstains came on. Either a ridiculous notion. Well, we'll get into that in a bit. So let's assess this fact then. Given the painting hypothesis, we have this fact that there's no body images under the bloodstains and or this invisible serum retraction rings at all. Could an artist have painted this with a traditional painting technique? And as I kind of argued in part 7 of my show, assessing Walter McCroney here, it's very improbable that an artist would be able to draw such realistic blood flows that fool all modern forensic experts that study the Shroud. And to do this without any body image to provide a referent at all. You just, on a blank cloth, this artist miraculously paints realistic blood flows as, some experts have said, as it appears congealed and flowing on real human skin. To quote, I think that was Gil Lavoie that I quoted in part 7 there saying that. And they got the proper size, the proper shape of the flows, the proper positions, all on a blank cloth. That's impossible. No, I'm sorry, skeptics. I don't have that much faith to believe that a medieval artist, let alone any artist, even modern forensic artists, would be able to do such a miraculous feat and then somehow get the body images painted perfectly without overlapping those things to align with those realistic bloodstain images. That's next to impossible in my mind. Additionally, as I said, human beings, it's been scientifically proven through actual experimentation that human beings just don't have the hand-eye-brain motor control that's necessary to consistently terminate the painted body images and or images produced by any other artistic technique, through powdered pigments or something like that. It's impossible for those to terminate right at the invisible serum retraction rings or bloodstains perfectly without any mistakes or any overlap at all. That's just impossible to do. And as we saw with other artistic mechanisms like the scorch or the protophoto methods, the body images would have had to have been formed first, and therefore they would be under the bloodstains and that sort of thing. The bloodstains wouldn't inhibit images from being formed or stop the body images from being underneath the bloodstains. And if we reverse, as we saw in those theories, if we reverse that, then there would be problems. If the bloodstains were first and then the body images formed in those ways, there would be problems with the blood that would make it evident that these mechanisms were used, but yet that's not what we have with the Shroud. So yeah, these artistic painting techniques don't work when we have the blood on there first and then the body images are formed afterward. Additionally, even more problematic, we know for scientifically proven fact that the bloodstains were transferred to the cloth in a liquid state or a serous state. They had to be a moist or wet state, but yet there's no evidence of smearing or damage on the blood marks at all. Despite them being entrenched into the cloth, they show up on the other side of the cloth. They soaked right down in. Proving they were liquid, and there's no smearing, no damage on the blood marks, not even at the microscopic level. These bloodstains are pristine. Now this would have been very difficult had the bloodstain images been painted. That again, human beings, even at the microscopic level, there would have been some kind of overlap or damage or some kind of smearing that might have taken place. We would have seen two-dimensional brush strokes would have been evident, but yet none of that's found on the shroud. Again, scientifically proven fact that they're not there. Okay, well, what about the other way around? So again, this pure traditional painting hypothesis technique, in terms of the bloodstains being painted, purely painted, without any direct contact being involved. Okay, well, we assessed it. What about if it wasn't the blood that was formed first, but instead we had the body images formed first in whatever way they were formed, and then the blood stains were painted on after the fact? Well, this is just as problematic. So in the first place, in order to account for the fact that there's no body images at all breaching the boundaries of the bloodstains and the invisible serum retraction rings, which medieval artists would have no clue about, we didn't know about until the 20th century even existed, so he couldn't have anticipated and guessed. And he just happened, coincidentally, got it perfect for every single bloodstain touching a body image. None of them overlap at all. Perfect, pristine, left intact, and that sort of thing. That's impossible. But what if the body images were produced first, and perhaps the artist left gaps for where he was going to paint in the bloodstains? Well, again, you have that that's impossible and ludicrous because, again, human beings simply, even modern forensic artists with the help and aid of modern scientific equipment, this was a scientific experiment that was done by actual scientists, and it was proven it's impossible for human beings to have the hand-eye brain coordination to be able to leave a gap and then perfectly fit in a bloodstain and serum retraction ring without any overlap or errors or boundaries being put in. Now, obviously, that's very implausible. People wouldn't say that. What most people would say is, okay, well, maybe the body images were formed, completed without any gaps, and then when the bloodstains came on, that somehow erased or got rid of or prevented body images from forming. Erased the body images or something, or prevented the body images as we have them today from forming. So that's really the most realistic end if you're going to go on this painted hypothesis. So how does this fare? Well, unfortunately, this is just as implausible because in the first place, positing that somehow this counteracted or erased some kind of artistic substance, a powdered pigment or a paint of some sort or a dye or a stain. Unfortunately, pigments, if we're positing that both the bloodstains and the body images were made of pigments don't counteract or erase other pigments in the way that's posited here. And even if we say, well, what about blood? Let's posit that the artist painted the bloodstains out of blood, which helps us out. It explains the serum retraction rings and that sort of thing, and the findings proving that it is in fact blood. Well, blood doesn't erase the paints or pigments of any known paint that could have been used for the body images. So yeah, even if blood was painted over top of the paint, it wouldn't get rid of the body images. Those painting pigments would still be there and detectable today, but unfortunately they're not. They're not found at all. And they're not found in the quantity that would be expected if the body images were in fact created in this way, created by some kind of artistic process, and then blood was painted over top of it. And again, if they used scorching, that the blood wouldn't get rid of that, or painting wouldn't get rid of the scorched body images underneath. If you have a proto-photo method, the blood or paints wouldn't get rid of the underlying body images that way either. Now, additionally, there were other problems that I mentioned in part 7. You go there and re-listen to that show for all the full details, but just to recap there, outside of this no body images underneath the bloodstains, there was tons of other issues. I mean, there's both on and off image. There's bloodstain images that are off image. They're not in the proper place. The scientists and forensic experts have studied it and said, oh, well, those would have come from the sides of the face. There's bloodstains from the sides of the face, but there's no body images of the side of the face or the body sides at all. But yet there's off-image bloodstains that correspond to where those bloodstains would be on the side of Jesus or something like that if the cloth was wrapped around it at one point, and then the blood came on the cloth or something like that. So there's off-image bloodstains. Painting hypothesis doesn't account for that. That's very improbable. Why would an artist want to paint bloodstains that just miraculously correspond to where modern forensic experts know would line up to a human body or face if it was wrapped around it in three-dimensional, 360 degrees or something, rather than just painting bloodstains that correspond to the visible body images. So that's problematic there. I think that the pure painting hypothesis doesn't make sense. You have to go with some kind of direct contact hypothesis to explain these off-image bloodstains and or a supernatural image or something like that. But also there's invisible scratches, lots and lots, hundreds and hundreds of invisible scratches that correspond. They're only visible in ultraviolet light in the 20th century. We didn't have a clue about them. Why would a medieval artist paint invisible scratches? Impossible. That would never happen. And even if you want to say, well, they were visible, but they were very light, and then over time they faded and became invisible or something like that, it's very ad hoc and improbable that a medieval artist would go to that much trouble to paint little 3 to 4 scratch marks in all of the scourge mark areas when he didn't have to. He already made his point. Why go to all that work of painting those very fine scratch marks in terms of the totality of the bloodstains and scourge wounds? They weren't just simply painted haphazardly on there. As one of the world's experts says, they weren't put onto the cloth. They were meticulously crafted, as one Shroud expert says. Furthermore, it's very ad hoc to suppose that every single one of those scratches just happened to fade enough to no longer be visible and is only visible through ultraviolet illumination and spectral imaging equipment known today in the 20th century and 21st centuries. No, at least 1 or 2 or more of the bloodstains, no matter how lightly painted, would still remain. I mean, look at how dark the bloodstains are today. Even with fading, they're still very clearly visible and that sort of thing. So it's very ad hoc to suppose that all of these invisible scratch wounds, the vast number of them that we have, that only showed up with UV lighting or modern photo camera technology, I think that's an improbable supposition on the part of a Shroud skeptic who says that all of these wounds and scourge wounds and bloodstains must have been painted using traditional painting technology, like a paintbrush or something like that. Finally, here's the main Achilles heel. We've done actual scientific experiments proving or falsifying that a pure painting technique can in fact create these bloodstains. And the first one I mentioned in part 7, I believe, was Dr. Pierre Barbet, who did scientific experiments. And he says, look, quote unquote, as a medical and anatomical expert, Dr. Pierre Barbet said, quote unquote, never would a medieval artist have succeeded in producing the stains of the Shroud of Turin with clearly marked edges with which such outstanding truthfulness reproduce the shape of the clots as they form naturally on the skin, without creating some detectable anatomical errors or encountering one of the many various problems which would inevitably arise and did arise during my own scientific experiments using blood. The sheer impossibility of a medieval artist being able to depict the bloodstains in ways that realistically depict blood as it would have flowed and congealed on actual human skin is simply breathtaking. Dr. Pierre Barbet, that says it all right there. It's the height of, you just, don't want to believe the truth if you're going to go in the face of this. But we have even more recent experiments from the 21st century with Dr. Mark Antinacci and Dr. Arthur Lynn, who've done scientific experiments testing the direct contact and the painting techniques for producing these bloodstains, and they've also yielded results that foster similar conclusions. So, for example, in their initial experiments, Dr. Arthur Lynn recognized that there is an obvious problem formed by the blood clotting process. And so they came up with various ways that would have been historically accurate for perhaps a medieval artist might have used to as an anticoagulant to prevent the blood from coagulating and thereby allow them to create similar images to the bloodstains on the Shroud of Turin. That's not a problem, but one of the main things they found in this main scientific experiment is there had to be precise things. So in order to create the bloodstains, they had to use a small thin brush with very trace amounts of blood, which again is counter to what we find on the Shroud. There's massive blood stains and that sort of thing. But in order to create images that are pristine, counter images, as Pierre Barbet says, of actual blood as it flows and congeals on human skin, they couldn't use a larger brush with larger amounts of blood, because all they would get was like an image with a less definable border or edge. However, when they used a smaller brush with less amounts of blood, again, the blood had an anticoagulant like lemon juice in it or something like that, or it was radically stirred. There was still a problem in that with the Shroud of Turin, one of the features or aspects of the bloodstains is that there's these meniscuses or darker edges of the shroud. When the blood clot retracts and leaving the serum retraction rings, it has upraised edges, and they're darker in color than the rest of the blood stain. This is what we find on the Shroud of Turin. And this is, again, not giving anything away, but Teddy Pappas is doing a lot of research about these borders and these meniscuses and how that might rule out a naturalistic hypothesis and that sort of thing. Again, that's future. I won't reveal anything she's working on, but I hope to have her on the show and we can go over that. But the point is here with Arthur Lynn, what he found is that when you use these techniques, as any artist would have to do if they're going to create the bloodstains using a paintbrush or painting technique, they don't get this darker circumference around the rest of the bloodstains. And because of this, I assigned it a questionable status. They kind of postulate, Arthur Lynn and Mark Antonacci postulate, well, maybe over time something happens, but nonetheless, during their experiments, and they waited days afterwards, using this technique, it didn't produce darker circumferences around the bloodstains, and that's contradictory to what we have with the Shroud of Turin. So that's another reason to rule out these painting things. But okay, so just to finish off our quick review of the pure painting hypothesis for explaining the bloodstains. Again, if you want even more full details, go read my 300-page chapter on my blog site. I include scholarly sources for you guys to check out. And or check out part 7 and 8, where I address Walter Macron's hypothesis, and I kind of include even more details than I have here in this review about how a traditional painting hypothesis can't explain the bloodstains and that sort of thing. So I want to end off this section before we turn to the next mechanism, the one that we're assessing in this part proper. But Dr. Barbet says, again, quote unquote, the bloodstained pictures were clearly not drawn by the hand of man. They could be nothing but the counter drawing made by blood which had been previously congealed on a human body. No artist would have been able to imagine for himself the minute details of those pictures, whether modern or otherwise, each one of which portrayed the detail of which we only now know about as of the 20th and 21st century, but which in the 14th century was totally unknown. But the fact is that none of us, not one of us, even with modern medical knowledge or otherwise, would be able to produce such pictures without falling into some blunder. So I think that says it all. You can see that the pure painting hypothesis cannot explain the bloodstains. And like I said, this was just a summary review. There are other problems that I covered elsewhere in terms of this hypothesis. So great. Therefore, we know that there has to be some form of direct contact to either, in full to explain the bloodstains, or as some kind of combination theory. There is direct contact, and then the painting was just a hypothesis was just a supplement or something like that. So let's first turn to direct contact in general. That's what we're assessing. Could direct contact alone create or encode the bloodstains that we find on the Shroud of Turin? Let's get into that right now. Now, right away, it's important to note that positing a direct contact mechanism handles and explains a lot of the features of the Shroud's bloodstain. So, for example, it would explain why there's real blood being used. Of course, that it used a dead human corpse that was bloodied, and then the blood transferred onto the cloth from there. It would also explain why there is off-image bloodstains. Well, the bloodstains were transferred when it was wrapped around the sides of the face or that sort of thing. And then subsequently, by the time the body images were formed, it was no longer wrapped around, and therefore the sides of the face and the sides of the body weren't encoded. So positing direct contact mechanisms would explain those. Another thing here is related to a counter feature, but it's about the enduring redness counter feature. Remember that Shroud's bloodstains seem to be red or more redder in color than they should be. Over time, blood is supposed to go black or brown and become darker in color over time. But that's not what we find with the Shroud. So, that was something that we said would support a painting hypothesis. And perhaps it could be used to rule out a direct contact, at least naturalistically speaking, mechanism. If the blood was used through direct contact and encoded onto the cloth that way, then we should expect the blood not to be so red in color. Now, obviously, as we're going to find out later on, there are supernatural mechanisms outside of just direct contact that can explain that. If there is some kind of radiation that would... Mark Anticoagulants, for example, has his historically consistent hypothesis, and he has an explanation based on a supernatural mechanism as to why the blood would remain red, and we'll get to that in a future show. But additionally, with direct contact as a naturalistic hypothesis, actually, it's not necessarily true that we would expect the blood to be darker shade brown or black, as opposed to the red color that we have and see on the Shroud today. There are naturalistic explanations as to why this could be the case, at least two, one of which is by Stirp blood chemist Dr. Alan Adler, who talks about the bilirubin of a tortured victim. They would have been if it was Jesus on the cross, he was tortured, scourged. Whether it was Jesus or not, this guy was obviously bloodied, and the corpse had blood all over it and was tortured and killed. He would have been in hypovolemic shock, whereby bilirubin is released into the bloodstream, and this ultimately is what allows for the blood to maintain its redness over the centuries and that sort of thing. So there are, and there's another naturalistic explanation as well. So direct contact theses can actually explain. It's possible or plausible that they explain the enduring redness counter feature of the Shroud's bloodstains as well. And finally, in terms of the main fact, we're going to go over this in a little bit more detail later on, but in terms of the fact that there's no body images under the bloodstains, depending on the mechanisms involved in producing the body images, and whether or not the bloodstains were encoded first before the body images or not, maybe this might be able to be explainable and that sort of thing. So with a pure direct contact, so just direct contact in terms of the body images and that, we'll assess that in a moment, whether that kind of mechanism for both body images and bloodstains will work or not. But just bear in mind, if there might be different types of mechanisms that may be able to explain that, in addition to pure direct contact for the bloodstains specifically. Okay, so with that said, let's get into some of the main problems. So in the first place, the main problem with direct contact theses in terms of the bloodstains, obviously these mechanisms would have to posit that the bloodstains were deposited onto the cloth first before the body images were formed. Again, barring any hybrid mechanisms where the body images were artistically formed or something like that, but just think about it. With a direct contact or some kind of ordinary naturalistic hypothesis, we would presume that, well, if the body is producing naturalistically the body images, that would take time. And the first thing is you have that bloody corpse. As soon as it's placed into the Shroud of Turin, then the blood would be transferred right away. So obviously the bloodstains had to have been created first. Again, if it's just some sort of ordinary naturalistic mechanism and not a hybrid artistic mechanism using a body or something like that. And the number one problem that arises is, well, look, the bloodstains, we know for a fact, were transferred to the cloth in a liquid or serous state. They weren't dry because it's a scientifically proven fact that it's impossible. Dry bloodstains don't transfer onto a cloth. And there's problems with remoistened or jelly-like bloodstains where they're remoistened or semi-wet. We'll get into that in a moment, but they don't transfer fully either in some cases. So they had to be pure liquid, and that way they get fully entrenched and they show up on the reverse side of the cloth. But then you would have inevitable smearing and damage of the bloodstains in the serum retraction rings. At least in some places, we would expect this when you're, putting the body into the shroud and stuff like that. There would be blood all over the place and smears all over the place. That's not what we have. We have realistic, pristine bloodstains as they would appear in their original flow on a human body in the location, shape, and size that would have been formed on the body itself with no disruptions in the bloodstains or the invisible serum retraction rings. There's no damage, alteration. And that seems to be very unlikely. And this kind of leads into, I had one commenter, I wish I had his name for you, but one commenter recently, and this is a common thing, this is against Jewish tradition. Look, the body's not washed, it's got bloodstains. All of that should have been washed off or something. And in the first place, I say, well, no, the Shroud of Turin proves that the body was washed in accordance with Jewish tradition, more or less, because if it wasn't washed at all, it would be a bloody mess. I mean, all of Jesus's blood wounds would be everywhere, and then they take him down from the cross. They're smearing him as they carry his body, smearing and damaging bloodstains all over the place. And then they would put that in the shroud. The shroud would just be a bloody mess. So we have proof. The fact that the bloodstains are in pristine condition proves that the body must have been washed. At the very least, partially. And that's where the controversy comes in. Was it a partial washing or was it a full washing? And I go for the option that it was a partial washing because there are some blood flows that some pro-shroud experts have said correspond to positions where Jesus had his arms on angles consistent with being on a cross, and then the blood flowed down or something like that. So obviously those wouldn't have been washed away if they're showing up on the Shroud of Turin. Again, barring a supernatural explanation that just puts them there supernaturally or magically or something like that. They weren't directly, they couldn't be put onto the shroud through naturally through direct contact. So because of those blood flows, again, that's not a minimal relevant feature, but if that's true, this is why some people say, well, it had to be a partial washing. They didn't get all of them. But for the stains that were washed away, well, then how did those blood stains become encoded through direct contact if they were washed away? Well, it's a scientifically proven fact. World's experts and forensic experts have body farms in Tennessee, and they go out and experiment. And they've proven that bodies will continue to bleed and ooze out hours after they're entirely dead. Barry Schwartz, for example, said it up to 4 to 6 hours. And Arthur Lynn and Mark Antinacci in their recent experiments have proven up to 12 hours, depending on the conditions. If the body's in a humid environment and a moist environment, like an empty tomb in Jerusalem, it could go up to 12 hours where these blood flows would continue to ooze out after he had been washed, and they would flow out and then transfer through direct contact to the cloth, supposedly, in a liquid state. So that's how they get around this fact that, blood will dry and harden very quickly within 30 minutes, I believe. When I go through this, I'll read through my book, I got the exact time limits and stuff like that. But I think it's very quick. It'll harden in the open air on skin. And then once it's dry, it won't transfer to a cloth. So, these are kind of problems and that sort of thing. And Shroud experts have said, well, no, not really. Because even if you got rid of all of that, blood can continue to emerge or ooze out up to between 6 to 12 hours, as much as 12 hours after the fact, after death. And it could have gotten onto the cloth that way through direct contact. So that's how they would explain these things. But okay, so we have this fact that they're totally undamaged or unsmeared, right? So in the first place, there's two aspects to this. When you're putting the body into the shroud, we would expect some smearing, and that's just inevitable. I mean, when you're placing the body and wrapping it up, definitely we have those off-image blood stains and stuff like that. There would be some smearing when you're putting the body into the Shroud of Turin itself. I guess the way out of that is, okay, well, he was fully washed, or he was washed, partially washed, and the stains that remained were dry at that time, and then subsequently they were remoistened. So in some way there was no transfer to the cloth during the time he was being wrapped. And then the bloodstains were encoded subsequent to that through direct contact onto the cloth. That's what you'd have to say or argue, naturalistically speaking at least. But then, okay, well, what about smearing? Obviously, we know scientifically that there's no decomposition liquids and that the body images were formed while the body was in a state of rigor mortis. So the body had to be taken out of the shroud very quickly, a matter of like 2 days or less, 48 hours or less, or 2 to 3 days at most, or something like that, in order to be consistent with the scientific empirical findings we have on the Shroud of Turin. If that was the case, then we would expect some smearing of the bloodstains, I would argue, when that body was being removed from the Shroud of Turin. So let me get into this. So obviously when we all get injured and that sort of thing, we have blood flows from time to time or get hurt or something like that. And what happens when we put something over top of it to stop the bleeding? We cover it with a Band-Aid or with a cloth or something like that. Well, you get these indistinct blobs when it's in liquid form. You don't get discernible pristine blood flows transferred to the cloth or to the Band-Aid. You get little indescribable or distinct blobs of blood. That's what we find on these wound dressings or Band-Aids. Well, that's not what we have with the Shroud of Turin. So yeah, one definitely wouldn't expect to see these blood flows in the exact shape, position, and size as would be forensic experts would expect of blood flowing on and congealing on human skin. Now, in terms of bloodstains, if it was a partial washing, how did those transfer into a liquid form onto the Shroud of Turin? Because all of those things are entrenched as well and show up on the reverse side of the cloth. Well, there obviously had to be some kind of remoistening given the humid environment of the empty tomb of Jesus or an environment similar to that. It could have been remoistened by, being covered in alloys or something like that, embalming solutions. And this is really necessary for the direct contact mechanism to even have a chance of working. And this is what Dr. Lind did in his scientific experiments. He kind of tested to see the details of how some of the blood stains and serum retraction rings on both the shroud and the body would still be moist, either in a liquid and or a serous or jelly-like remoistened state, depending on the length of time being postulated between the blood flows and the incodation onto the cloth through direct contact. And he found, once again, he concluded in his experiments that it's inevitable smearing, alteration, and or damage of the blood during the process of removing the body from the cloth would inevitably result, given the short time frame of the removal of the body. At least some of the bloodstains must have still been moist or in a jelly-like state, whereby smearing or alteration or some kind of damage would have been detectable, or would have happened and then been detectable by STIRP. yet that's not found on the Shroud of Turin. But yeah, let's get into a little bit more detail about some of the scientific experiments that have been done in the 20th and 21st century with respect to testing the direct contact mechanism for encoding the bloodstain images. So the two main or most thorough scientific investigations of this sort were those done by Dr. Gilbert Lavoie, and then later on in the 21st century by Dr. Arthur Land and Mark Antonacci. So starting with Dr. Gilbert Lavoie. So Dr. Gilbert Lavoie, he attempted to duplicate the blood transfer of one bloodstain, one of the Shroud Man's bloodstains in particular. Namely, that was the epsilon-shaped blood clot seen on the Shroud Man's forehead. So what he did, he was able to conduct tests on human blood samples using both plastic and actual human skin. And he claimed that afterwards, the blood had started to clot retraction, had started the process of clot retraction, approximately about 30 minutes after being placed on the surface. From there, he then placed a piece of linen on top of it every half hour, up to a total of 3.5 hours for the plastic sample, and up to 2 hours for the skin sample. And that's provided that the skin was continuously remoistened with a saline solution to simulate the sweaty body, as well as the conditions within a hypothetically or possibly damp burial tomb complex. Now, Lavoie's methods allowed the blood to delay becoming coagulated too quickly, similar to how an anticoagulant, like using lemon juice, would have worked when we discussed the pure painting hypothesis. And in this case, it's plausible to assume that Jesus, his blood would have had anticoagulant properties to it because of so much severe bleeding from his torture, scourging, and crucifixion, so that this would cause his clotting factors to be depleted. So that would allow the blood to remain moist for a longer period of time. Again, we're giving conditions as favorable as we possibly can for the Shroud skeptic who wants to argue for the naturalistic direct contact thesis here. And yet, despite all of his best efforts, all of these helpful concessions to help the skeptic, Lavoie wasn't even able to replicate all of the aspects of this single blood mark itself, let alone duplicate all of the features of all of the Shroud's various bloodstains. So yeah, Dr. Lavoie's blood marks results really suffered from various issues. So here they are in list format. So Lavoie's results, number 1, they lacked the presence of the apparent serum retraction rings. 2, they did not maintain their bright red color over the years, thus lacking that Shroud of Turin counterfeature, the enduring redness. 3, they did not maintain the distinct size and shape of realistic blood flows as they would have flowed and congealed on human skin. And finally, 4, they were not embedded on both sides of the linen, just having a slightly fainter mirror image on the corresponding reverse of the outer side of the cloth. So that is nothing like the Shroud of Turin at all. And lastly, a major issue for him is that, look, Lavoie's methods called for remoistening the blood after it had dried. However, depending on the extent of the remoistening, such a process really could have only, at best, merely created jelly-like coagulated blood flows. And those have never been transferred from a body to a cloth in pristine condition, like what we have with the Shroud of Turin, let alone, as we saw, doing it in such a way that they would become embedded and soaked into the cloth all the way through to the other side, creating perfect counter images on the other side of the cloth. So, yeah, as you can see, Dr. Lavoie, Gil Lavoie, did a great effort here, but despite his best attempts, he just came out with problems for the Shroud skeptics who want to propose that the bloodstains were formed through direct contact. And obviously by Shroud skeptics there, I'm including people that are generally genuinely considered pro-Shroud in other contexts, people like Barry Schwartz and that sort of thing, or Ray Rogers. So I'm not just talking about, Colin Barry or Hugh Ferry type Shroud skeptics here, but I think that, yeah, this is the first round of scientific experiments, and it's not looking good for them on this front. But there have been some issues with Gil Lavoie's methods that some have said, yeah, well, I mean, who cares about plastic, for example? What does it matter how it performed on plastic? We should only care about the tests about how it performed on skin and stuff like that. So there have been some issues with Gil Lavoie's results, and that's where the more recent experiments from Dr. Arthur Lind and Mark Antinacci come in. Again, testing out this direct contact mechanism and how it operates in terms of transferring the bloodstains to the cloth. So yeah, Dr. Arthur Lind, he conducted a very extensive series of scientific experiments to try and reproduce the Shroud's bloodstains using various direct contact methods. I'll include the article in the sources on my blog, so make sure you guys check that out and get more details better than I cover in the show. But yeah, once again, the results of all these tests could not even duplicate all the features or properties of a single blood mark, let alone all the aspects of every single bloodstain on the Shroud of Turin. So in his first series of experiments, he was using pig's blood on a live human forearm, for example, and he found right away that the fresh blood was completely dry within 30 minutes of being placed on the arm. So this is similar to what Gil Lavoie found. 30 minutes, it's dry, won't transfer. And this was irrespective of air temperature or other external environmental conditions. They tried various environmental factors to see if could it prolong the amount of time that the blood would stay moist enough to be or in a liquid state to transfer to the cloth. What they found is that really 30 minutes, the blood would be completely dry within 30 minutes. So, and once that happens, it's entirely unable to transfer to the cloth at all, with the exception of a few drips, quote unquote, a few drips from the tips of the arm hairs, which were still wet after the 30-minute period. So this really demonstrated conclusively that the blood can only have been transferred through direct contact from a body to the cloth in a moist and or a liquid state. This confirms that aspect of the bloodstain transfer process. And it really narrows down the time frame whereby this is possible to happen. It has to happen at a very early stage while the blood is still in a liquid state. And we know that the body will only produce liquid blood up to 12 hours at most after the time of death. So that's the very latest that these bloodstains could have flowed, and then very quickly they will dry up, irrespective of the environmental conditions. It may take plus or minus a little bit longer or something like that. There's also the condition of the body. Again, Jesus his blood clotting factors would have been depleted, so that would have given extra time, but not enough given these scientific experiments to extend that period. The bloodstains would be totally dry, by the next day, on the second day, or at the time of the resurrection or something like that, 3 days later and stuff like that. Like, we can't just be positing a long time afterwards kind of thing, because the bloodstains would either be completely dry or in a moist environment, like a humid environment, like the empty tomb, if we're just granting that. Even in those conditions, at best, it'll be in a moist, like jelly-like state. And with those, you don't get complete transfers. In the first place, some bloodstains will be in different states, dry versus jelly-like and that sort of thing. They won't all be in the exact same state to transfer all the bloodstains in pristine condition perfectly at the same time. And with the jelly-like, even within a single bloodstain in a jelly-like state, at best, only parts of it become transferred. Again, it's smearable, but you wouldn't get a complete whole bloodstain in the size and shape and position as it flows on human skin being transferred to the cloth. And was even scientifically confirmed because as the blood begins to clot during these scientific experiments, they observed that the human skin, as the blood clots on the human skin, the skin gains large, deep wrinkles within it as the blood clots on it. And this definitely prevents the uniform, universal, and intimate contact needed between the body and the linen cloth in terms of the blood stains within these crevices or wrinkles on the human skin. And therefore you get, quote-unquote, discontinuous blood stains on the transferred blood image to the linen. And this is totally unlike the Shroud's blood stains, which are thoroughly, universally continuous entirely throughout without any detectable disruptions at all. So what if you want to go for direct contact, you have to say that all of the blood stains were formed after the body washing, after the body was placed into the Shroud somehow, and very quickly the body started oozing within period of hours or something like that, and then they all transferred in that perfect liquid state and became embedded into the cloth that way. How that would work with dry pre-burial bloodstains, to posit, well, they all became re-moistened and wet enough to go into a liquid state and then transfer fully onto the Shroud of Turin. That seems a little bit dubious given these scientific experiments. If there were these pre-blood flows and they weren't washed off, the body wasn't fully washed, but only partially washed, and they remained there, how did they become wet enough to be transferred onto the cloth? I think there's some questionability there. Obviously, if you think that the body was fully washed, then you're going to say, well, these blood flows were formed in the same way the other blood flows were. After the burial had taken place, the blood oozed out for a few hours afterwards and flowed down. But then you'd have to answer the results about, well, what about the angles of the blood flows? Why does it look like some of the blood flows are like he's hanging on a cross and he's got his arms extended and stuff like that? So you'd have to deal with that. But since that's not a minimal relevant feature, I won't hold that against direct contact mechanisms in this case. Another aspect that came up in Lynn's experiments was the fact that none of the blood marks that he produced using his experiments had darker or denser circumferences compared to the milder center, milder in terms of color, the red color. And that's distinct. That's a contradiction to what we have with the Shroud's bloodstains. They have this darker circumference or perimeter around the bloodstains. It's a darker color of red. And we don't have that. Even though the results, they did get produce some embedded bloodstains that do look somewhat similar to those found on the Shroud, but they don't have these darker perimeters. And there is also some issues. So they produced, at best, quote-unquote good transfers that were relatively similar to the Shroud's embedded bloodstains. But Lind qualifies this by saying that, quote-unquote, the only bloodstains achieving perfect intimate contact between the body and the cloth can be transferred successfully. And Lind subsequently mentions that such a scenario would be extremely unlikely to have all of the relevant factors. He tested up to 100% humidity, the perfect humid environment to keep these bloodstains moist, so that you don't have to so that they could be remoistened every 16 to 32 minutes so that they wouldn't dry up and transfer. And he says, look, all of these fine-tuned environmental conditions coming together would be extremely unlikely to occur for all of the blood marks on the Shroud. Maybe it might account for one or two of them, but for all of these hundreds of blood stains and scratches and scourge marks, that's very unlikely. They would be in differing states, and they wouldn't transfer, is what Lind is arguing here. And remember those wrinkles. The key word here is that there needs to be perfect intimate contact between the cloth and the blood stain and the blood areas here. But Lind concludes, he actually calculated, look, with quote-unquote measurements of the surface of skin and a leather belt, showed that there was, even with a slight dimple, that was only 0.09 millimeters deep. That's about the thickness of a piece of paper. Even with a little wrinkle that slight means that no blood was transferred. You'd get discontinuous blood stains. And when you apply that to a dead human corpse where the surface of the skin is not smooth, it's not even as smooth as leather. It has body hair throughout it. The human skin overlays muscles, bones, edges, joints, all throughout the entire body. And the fact that many parts of the front and back of the man in the shroud would not even have been in contact with the naturally draped shroud, and that pressure could not have been placed on the outer sides of the cloth throughout all the points on the front and back of a body equally, or in the proper manner to get it into all of those crevices and wrinkles to encode them. It seems very unlikely that this is what is occurring here. And yeah, like I said, even if you have a dip 0.09 millimeters or more thickness of a piece of paper, that little dip is enough to say that the bloodstains won't be encoded and you will get discontinuous bloodstains on your Shroud of Turin. But that's not what we find. The shroud is perfectly complete over all those varying surfaces of the body and all of these areas to encode these liquid bloodstains and that sort of thing. That seems very improbable, and it seems very ad hoc to suppose that could happen naturalistically or just through natural law and random chance alone. And this leads into the fact that on the bloodstains, there are non-contact areas encoded in terms of bloodstains. There are bloodstains encoded on the shroud that would have been, entire bloodstains wouldn't have been in contact with the cloth at all, let alone having perfect intimate contact. They just wouldn't be touching at all. So there are entire bloodstains encoded on the shroud that shouldn't be there at all because no part of them was touching the cloth, given the position of the man in the body. Again, pure direct contact theses posit that there's a real human body, given the positioning of the human body with an upraised leg, a rigid position with arms crossed over his groin and the left leg slightly upraised with both feet pointed down. Well, there are several bloodstains and scourge wounds that simply wouldn't have been in contact with a naturally draped cloth at all. And these include scourge marks on the back of the left upraised leg, 2 scourge marks on the lower or small of the arched back. When you lie down in that position, the small of your back is arched and therefore wouldn't be touching the dorsal side cloth. What else? 3, we also have scourge marks at the top of the shoulders near the neck and above the shoulder blades. They wouldn't have been touching the cloth. We have the side wound, which we're not 100% sure, but may or may not have been partially obstructed from making contact with a naturally draped cloth by the location of the upper arm. And there's at least the 20 different bloodstains from the back of the shroud man's round head. Those would not have been in contact with the cloth, even when the cloth was wrapped around the entire head. And it's important to note that these stains are, just like the other images, embedded into the cloth. It's not like they're just lightly encoded. No, they're encoded just as forcefully as any other bloodstain that was in direct intimate contact. They're embedded onto the other reverse side of the cloth in the exact counter mirror image. So how would we explain these things? We would expect, with a naturally draped cloth, we would expect anything that's 0.09 millimeters deep or more would not be encoded. So we would have discontinuous blood stains within a single blood stain. It would be discontinuous and that sort of thing. And also with the non-contact blood stains, entire blood stains that are seen on the Shroud Man shouldn't be there at all. Not even in a discontinuous state. They should just not be there. But yet they're there. So there's only one way to get around this with a pure direct contact thesis, and that's to posit some kind of external pressure being applied to the shroud to touch these areas and bring them into perfect intimate contact, either by wrapping around with a strips, those linen strips around the head and around the body, as Dr. John Jackson has illustrated might be a potential way that the shroud had strips wrapped around it, the cloth, putting it to the body. Or maybe there was John German's theory, there's a wet cloth and it sagged and then pressed, or as the body decomposed, it became pressed into those areas or something like that, and thereby brought them into contact. But again, these are very ad hoc. There would have to be fine-tuning for that to happen. And more importantly, I think it's scientifically impossible because, again, we know for a fact. So this is the first attempt with the bloodstains. I can prove that the Shroud of Turin's images are extraordinary or miraculous and must have been encoded miraculously, irrespective of the body images. Pretend I fail at that, and those can be explained naturally. Nonetheless, I think that it's improbable that the bloodstains were formed naturalistically through ordinary natural mechanisms. They would be miraculous or proven to be quote-unquote extraordinary, as I call it in my premise 8 of my 11 premise argument on my website. They can't be explained through ordinary natural mechanisms like direct contact. So just to kind of recap where we are. First, we looked at just a pure painting or artistic approach, right? Whereby the bloodstains were painted using a traditional paintbrush or something like that. And regardless of whether you think if the bloodstains were painted first, well, that's very improbable. Number one, without any referent, how would you get realistic blood flows in the proper positions, and then align that up to your body images? And secondly, it's scientifically impossible, even for modern forensic artists who know what they're doing and have the aid of modern scientific equipment to help them, guide them, to terminate the body images at the invisible serum retraction rings and bloodstains, so that there's no body images overlapping the bloodstains at all. Secondly, if the body images were created first in some way, and then the bloodstains were painted over top of them, that would not erase or get rid of the materials or artistic techniques or whatever technique was used to create the body images. It would not erase that. We would still detect those body images underneath the bloodstains today, whatever materials, paints, pigments, whatever it was to create the body images, powder, those would still be there even if you painted blood over top of them. So blood doesn't have the erasing effect. Then if we look at the pure direct contact approach, obviously with these approaches, it's impossible to have the body images first, really. So it would probably be the bloodstains first, and that prevented the body images from forming through direct contact. But the problem is that there's these non-contact zones, and scientific experiments show that anything 0.09 millimeters deep or even more or deeper will not create perfect intimate contact between the bloodstains and the cloth, and therefore won't encode. And there would be lots of that on a human body, areas deeper than that. And we have, given the position of the body, we know that there are bloodstains encoded in a liquid state that wouldn't be in contact at all with the cloth in any way. And in order to make the cloth connect with them, you would have to provide pressure, some sort of external pressure, or the cloth was wet and the cloth was made to conform in one way or the other through wetness or a humid environment, or like the body decomposing again. And it would have to be, with the body decomposing, that wouldn't work because it would have to happen very quickly, and bodies don't decay that quickly to do it. But yeah, either a wet cloth or some kind of external pressure through tying linen strips around the body that's put in the shroud afterwards as a burial custom or something like that. And or putting spices next to the body so that somehow, in one way or another, all of these non-contact blood zones would be made to contact the cloth itself, and therefore being encoded onto the shroud. But here's where the problem comes in. If that happens, then there would inevitably be some smearing, damage, or alteration to some of the bloodstains where these external forces are at work, right? I mean, remember, when you've got a bloody Band-Aid, all of these bloodstains had to be in liquid form in order to be transferred. Jelly-like doesn't do it, and or when it's dry, it doesn't transfer at all to a cloth. So it was in a liquid or serous form. There's a technical scientific word for it. I think it's fibrinosis state, something like that. Probably butchered that. It's in the sources that I provide, though, but otherwise they won't transfer at all. But then if you apply pressure, it's going to be blobby. You're not going to get pristine blood flows in the shape, size, and position that they would have flowed and congealed on a human body or corpse. You would get some of the Band-Aid effect, or, bandages or wound clothes or something like that, that we all see. You just get this bloody blob. It's an indistinct blob. It's not the shape of a blood flow and stuff like that. Additionally, with direct contact, there are the other issues, like the darker perimeter around the bloodstains that seem not to be possible or consistent with a pure painting hypothesis or a direct contact hypothesis. Arthur Lynn's experiments kind of prove that. Either you use a large brush and you get the darker perimeters, but you get indistinct blobs. You don't get pristine blood flows. Or you use a smaller brush and you get the pristine blood flows, but you don't get the darker perimeter. And with pure direct contact, you don't get that darker perimeter, so it's questionable. There are explanations like, oh, well, maybe some of the color flaked off from inside the bloodstains over the centuries. So I gave questionable status there. But yeah, the main important thing is that the smearing argument against the pure direct contact hypothesis, in order to try and encode those, get intimate contact for those non-contact bloodstains, and or the areas where there would be dips in the body beyond 0.09 millimeters in order to encode those. And bear in mind, that argument applies regardless of whether the body images were formed first in whatever way, or the bloodstains were encoded first and then the body images afterwards. Either way, this smearing argument based on the non-contact areas applies regardless of which were formed first. And just before I move on, there's one last thing I wanted to mention about the pure direct contact, just a correction of something I said earlier. So it's been scientifically proven that blood will ooze out of bodies 4 to 6 hours after they're dead, after they've deceased, up to 4 to 6 hours after they've deceased. This has been studied on various body farms and that sort of thing, like the big one in Tennessee. But in terms of the 12 hours, I said that wrong. It's not after 12 hours after they've died, but up to 12 hours after they've incurred an injury. A living body incurs an injury. Up to 12 hours after that, the wound can still continue to bleed under certain conditions. So that's what I meant to say there. But yeah, outside of that, we have a third ordinary naturalistic mechanism that we've neglected to mention here, and that's the hybrid or combination theory. Maybe some kind of artist, medieval or otherwise, or earlier, used a combination of direct contact and a painting technique to create the bloodstains on the Shroud of Turin. So let's say they covered a human corpse, a bloody human corpse, and encoded all of the bloodstains that would be encoded through a naturally draped cloth without applying external pressure or making the cloth conform so as to encode the non-contact bloodstains. They waited for those to dry, and then, they washed the body first, so that whatever, and then got those blood stains. They dried, or he waited for a little bit so that when they took off the shroud, there wouldn't be smearing or damage to the blood stains and that sort of thing. And then they used paint and painted in any of the gaps. that would help them. So the painter would have a referent because they'd be using a human body. So they would, oh, okay, well, wherever the bloodstains on this bloody corpse were left, I can see where the bloodstains are, and I can see there's a gap here, so I'll paint in the gap with blood here. I'm looking at the dead corpse, and there's no bloodstains at all encoded here, but I can see there's some scratches, or there's a bloodstain here in the non-contact areas that need bloodstains, and then they painted that in. So this hybrid technique does solve some of the issues with direct contact and or painting when treated as a pure 100% that technique. By combining these techniques, it possibly solves some issues. So what do I think about this type of mechanism? Well, in order to be consistent with the body being in a state of rigor mortis, or to explain that rigidity, which we think is rigor mortis if there's a human body, and there being no decomposition liquids, and no smearing on the Shroud's bloodstains. So you'd have to wait until the Shroud's bloodstains dry enough. They can't be in a moist jelly-like state, any one of them. It has to be before decomposition liquids fill up and or rigor mortis ends, which is the maximum of 48 hours. So it would have to be, he waited a certain amount of time for the bloodstains to completely dry. Majority of them dry in the areas he would have been talking about, and then he unwrapped the body or took the shroud off the body without smearing any of the bloodstains after any time between the 12-hour mark to the 48-hour mark, sometime in there. Now, the problem is, again, it depends on the environment. We can't assume that as part of our minimal relevant features approach. We can't assert and assume that he was in a humid tomb and then that sort of thing. We don't know what the environment was. But nonetheless, I do think that it would be, given the direct contact mechanism for the body images being posited, and there's alloys and certain things like that, bloody sweat and all this stuff, it would be reasonable to assume that some of the bloodstains would still be in a moist jelly-like or a pasty type state at least, and those would smear once you rip off the shroud there, depending on where you apply pressure and start removing the body from the shroud in order to avoid the buildup of decomposition liquids within that time period. Also, if you painted using real blood, painted in the gaps of existing shroud bloodstains from the direct contact itself, there would inevitably be, with the human hand, some smearing, some sort of mistakes or blunders that would happen, and thereby cause some smudging of some of the bloodstains or damage to at least some of the bloodstains. I think I don't think a human being would be capable of painting in a discontinuity in an existing bloodstain that was partially formed, and then fill in the gaps perfectly. And let alone, there would have to be, from a naturally draped cloth, there would have to be those non-contact bloodstains that were just not even encoded at all, and he would have had to create those. That suffers from the critique that we gave in terms of the pure painting hypothesis. There's no two-dimensional brushstrokes, nor it would suffer from the problems accounting for the body image. No body image is being under the bloodstains, because in this case, if it's a pure direct contact hypothesis for both the body images and that, you'd say, well, the bloody sweat would be there in the contact zone regardless. Or if it's in the non-contact zones, how did the artist just miraculously know where, invisible to the naked eye, where the non-contact zones were, and why would he paint the bloodstains in those precise areas just by pure chance alone? That's very improbable. If you can't see, the images take time to form through the direct contact hypothesis. Even if they were somewhat visible, why wouldn't he paint over the body images, paint some of the wounds over the body images? I mean, it wouldn't matter to him as a medieval artist or earlier artist. as a medieval artist or a Dark Age artist or whatever, anytime medieval ages or before, he wouldn't have cared about, oh, I have to make sure I paint these non-contact blood stains in areas where the body image hasn't been encoded or something. And we saw all of the other artistic mechanisms on offer at that time. Blood stains wouldn't prevent overlap in terms of body images. Pigments, paints, powders, scorching would have charred the blood stains. All of the other artistic mechanisms for encoding the body images would leave their mark on blood stains, or would remain if blood stains were painted on top of them and that sort of thing. So I don't think that this is improbable as a mechanism. Really, the best bet is to stick with the direct contact hypothesis for the bloodstains, but then it suffers from that smearing problem. So either there's going to be smearing, or you didn't apply pressure, and then you're going to have non-contact areas of bloodstains being miraculously encoded somehow through the air. And that can't be. So yeah, that's why I would assign a 55%. I'm 55% convinced that the Shroud is miraculous, or the encodation of the blood stains, independently of whatever happens with the body images and how they were formed. The blood stain images on the Shroud of Turin, I'm 55% to 60% convinced, are what I call extraordinary in my 11 premise argument. On this basis, because none of the naturalistic mechanisms or ordinary natural mechanisms like painting, direct contact, and or the hybrid approach can account for them. They all suffer with problems that make them improbable to impossible to explain the bloodstain and their features as seen on the Shroud of Turin. So yeah, I think that's it in terms of the bloodstains. We can finally move on. I spent a lot of time on that, just because this constitutes one of my arguments for why I think the Shroud of Turin images and their formation fulfill criterion B for what I call a G-belief authenticating event, as seen in premise 8 of my 11 premise argument on my blog site, for those who want to check that out. Yeah, so I spend a lot of time there. Thankfully, in future shows, when I cover other ordinary naturalistic mechanisms, I'll just refer back to this show rather than re-going over any of the bloodstain encodation stuff. That's it. Let's get into our overall assessment. Okay, so doing our cumulative case considerations and conclusions here for the direct contact mechanism. First criterion is plausibility. And on a theoretical level, it might seem, at least at face value, that, well, this is fully plausible. I mean, as I said, I even had one listener, and he's correct, mentioned that, there's been bloodied and beaten dead bodies placed in linen cloths or garments, and that happens all the time. And bodies do in fact stain these kinds of linen garments and that sort of thing. So, on the face of it, it might seem there is an initial plausibility to this thesis, at least on a theoretical level. Although I would say that it is highly implausible just in terms of all the Shroud's features, because those haven't been seen on other Shroud cloths and that sort of thing, like encoding the full three-dimensional information, vertically mapped wrapping distortions, unaltered blood stains, not smeared or damaged in any way. Those are implausible on a theoretical level. But additionally, on a practical level, the Shroud is totally unique in all of human history. And in the first place, we've had natural sufficient opportunity, perhaps, because there's been millions and millions of people buried in linen burial shrouds throughout all across the centuries and all of time. And none of them are comparable to what we have with the Shroud. The Shroud is totally unique. That's unexpected. Now, when it comes to natural opportunity, whether or not there's a natural sufficient opportunity for duplication in an ordinary naturalistic context, some Shroud skeptics, like Dan Spicer, for example, who we're going to be learning about in a future show, have tried to say, well, there were unique circumstances surrounding Jesus. So, for example, he wasn't fully washed. Well, that's different than other burial victims, and that maybe that difference is what led to the fact that only the Shroud of Turin has this, but has these images. But again, once again, there would have been sufficient opportunity, naturally speaking, for someone else to have a hasty burial, at least one other person that would have been come around and produced at least, like, the Shroud of Agamemnon, the Shroud of some random dude, or the Shroud of Pontius Pilate, or something like that. Obviously the pagans didn't always use burial shrouds, but you get what I'm saying. Like, somebody would have produced similar images and had similar circumstances to account for these, even if the circumstances for the man in the shroud weren't always typical. They didn't have a full-on proper burial or something like that. I don't think we can point to those. And even if those circumstances did explain why the shroud was unique, meaning there wasn't a sufficient opportunity, well, there's been various field and lab experiments, artificial opportunities, and those have been sufficient because they've accounted for all of these various factors that would have been so-called unique to the man in the shroud, and yet they still couldn't reproduce all these features. So it is definitely unique, despite there having been a sufficient artificial opportunity, and I would argue also a sufficient natural opportunity as well, even if there is some nuance that would need to be made on that front. What's more, in terms of the bloodstains are totally unique in human history. We've had lots of opportunity, and the circumstances are relevant to that. I mean, we've had lots of opportunity for bloodied corpses to be wrapped around, or for linen cloths or things to be wrapped around blood as it's flowing on human skin. And again, they've never come out pristine or in this way. It's totally unique in that way, and I think that there's been a sufficient opportunity for duplication in all of the linen cloths or burial wrappings that have been put over bloody people, in wars and stuff like that. It's not even just burial garments where you can say, yeah, but they fully washed the bodies. Well, yeah, but again, dead corpses will continue to bleed up to hours afterwards, 4 to 6 hours afterwards, and that sort of thing. So there'd be at least one you would expect that would compare to what we see with the Shroud of Turin. So I think that's it in terms of the plausibility criterion. I think it's implausible given the uniqueness of the shroud, and also just on a theoretical level in terms of reproducing the bloodstains and or some of the specific features of the shroud, like superficiality. It seems implausible a priori that a direct contact mechanism would account for these, just knowing our background knowledge of how gravity operates and stuff like that. Okay, so in terms of explanatory scope, we saw that all the direct contact hypotheses have multiple relevant features or aspects that they fail to explain. And superficiality, the bloodstains, the three-dimensional information, the vertically wrapped mapping distortions, etc., body image uniformity, they all fail this. And thus, in turn, it also lacks explanatory power. It fails the explanatory power criterion. Because it's in some cases, it's even scientifically impossible, physically impossible for the pure direct contact mechanism to account for the uniformity, vertically mapped wrapping distortions, superficiality, and 3D information. Additionally, there are several questionable elements that I assigned a questionable status in terms of this mechanism being able to do it. So it fails explanatory power and explanatory scope criterions as well. Okay, what about the less ad hoc criterion? These hypotheses do employ some non-evidenced assumptions in order to work, and in order to be consistent with what we find on the Shroud of Turin's images. I kind of hinted at those as we did our assessment of each feature and aspect under those features. But there's no signs of decomposition or any biochemical molecules or embalming substances at all. And proponents would have to postulate, they all just oxidized or decayed over the centuries and just happened to be gone. Not even a residual trace element that would be detectable. And that's unexpected. That's not what we would expect given these theories. So this is just a non-evidenced assumption. There are several aspects where there's this high fine-tuning that would be required precisely to make this technique work. And then with the bloodstains, there's an ad hoc component where people like Barry Schwartz and that have said, the darker perimeters and the lighter color of redness in the center of the bloodstains, oh, well, that's just caused by wear and tear, and there isn't any, all of it. It just perfectly the perimeter and everything in the middle has flaked off. Well, maybe we would expect a mixed result. Maybe some of the middle of the bloodstains didn't flake off, whereas the outer perimeters did flake off or something like that. So I think that's a kind of an ad hoc element as well. That's kind of my assessment of this direct contact thesis. It fails to explain, lacks explanatory power and scope, and is implausible with respect to the body images, in addition to employing certain ad hoc elements. And in terms of the bloodstains, once again, utterly lacks explanatory power in terms of explaining how the bloodstains and all their features formed on the Shroud of Turin. So, with that said, it's a failure. That's my assessment of the direct contact mechanism. So this show is very long. Sorry about that. Next time it will be shorter for the Shroud show because I don't have to go over all of the details for the bloodstains in particular. My apologies. I know that some parts of these were rushed. I was planning to have certain guest shows. Those didn't work out. So I kind of had to rush in a Shroud solo show for you guys before very quickly. And I didn't have time to reread the literature apart from what I wrote my chapter first. So my apologies for that. But again, I provide the sources so you guys can go into the details and check those out to make up for any deficiencies in the podcast here, or go back and read my 300-page chapter and that sort of thing. But I think that I've done a good job here of covering the main elements of why direct contact doesn't work, why nobody advances this theory past the 1980s, and that sort of thing. And next time, a more popular version of kind of an ordinary naturalistic theory is going to be our 8th one, and that's going to be gas evaporation or gas diffusion naturalistic mechanisms. So this is where people like Barry Schwartz would come in, Ray Rogers, Paul Vignon, he had his vapograph theory, stuff like that. We're going to look at a couple of these gas diffusion type mechanisms, both Paul Vignon's vapograph hypothesis and then the more recent and famous STIRP scientist, Dr. Ray Rogers' Maillard reaction, which is something that Gary Habermas and Barry Schwartz, Gary Habermas admits, it produced the best sort of naturalistic explanation in terms of the coloring, and also Barry Schwartz thinks that the Maillard reaction is definitely one of the components involved in terms of explaining the Shroud's images, naturalistically speaking. It can't do everything, but he thinks it's part of the story. So we're going to look at those two next time. But for now, I will shut up and end the podcast. I would tell you what I have next week. I'm not sure because I've been having issues with some of the guest shows and organizing those. We do have a confirmation with at least one. I don't know when it's going to be for, but with Dr. Egil German, and he's an expert in Jewish studies and Jewish Christianity, and we're going to be talking to him about Torah observant Christianity and stuff like that. I've also got a confirmation without a date with Dr. Paul Bali and a friend of his talking about the COVID restrictions and vaccine mandates and all this stuff in relation to religious rights. So that's how it relates to my podcast. It's not just a political thing, but we're going to be kind of getting into, well, how does that relate to the upholding of religious rights? Should the government be allowed not to tell us to go to church or stuff like that for a health concern? So those guests are definitely confirmed, and I'm working on the other ones. My apologies for that. But other than that, have a great week.